I forgot to tell my wife I had fixed the hidden camera in the living room. When I sat down in the dark to review the footage, expecting maybe to catch our housekeeper slipping out early, I saw my wife of 45 years holding a small glass vial. Her son-in-law leaned in and whispered 3 drops in his coffee every morning. It mimics Alzheimer's perfectly. What happened next changed my life forever. My name is Clarence. I am 70 years old, and before I tell you how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light no matter how deeply it is buried. It was 2 in the morning. The sprawling house we owned in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta was completely silent. The only illumination in my dark home office came from the cold blue glow of my laptop screen. I had spent 35 years of my life as a fraud investigator for the IRS. I made a career out of following paper trails, reading between the lines, and catching people in their most elaborate lies. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the lie sitting in my own living room. A few days earlier, the security camera hidden in the bookshelf had stopped working. I am a man who likes to keep his hands busy, so I took it apart, replaced a faulty wire, and got it running again. I just forgot to mention it to my wife, Vivian. I was just scrolling through the footage to make sure the motion sensor was calibrated correctly. Then I saw them. Vivian, the woman I had built a life with for 45 years, was sitting on the expensive leather sofa. Across from her sat Trent. Trent is a 38-year-old white real estate developer who married our daughter Maya 5 years ago. He always carried himself with a slick, unearned arrogance, wearing custom-tailored suits and driving cars he constantly traded in for newer models. I never liked him, but I kept my peace for my daughter's sake. On the screen, the living room was dimly lit. The timestamp read, "Yesterday afternoon, right around the time I usually take my daily nap." Trent reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a small dark glass vial. He placed it on the coffee table and slid it toward my wife. I turned the volume all the way up, pressing my headphones tightly against my ears. Trent leaned forward, his voice a low, calculated whisper. He told her to put 3 drops in my coffee every morning. He said his doctor promised it mimics the symptoms of Alzheimer's perfectly. He said I would get confused, I would forget things, and my hands would shake. Vivian stared at the vial. She did not look horrified. She did not slap him. She did not kick him out of the house I bought with my hard-earned money. Instead, she picked up the vial and examined it. "We need him incapacitated by the end of the month," Trent continued, his tone turning sharp and urgent. "Once the doctor signs off on his mental decline, we can activate the power of attorney. We need that land, Vivian. If we do not get control of his assets soon, everything falls apart." Vivian nodded slowly. Her face was completely devoid of emotion. She slipped the vial into her designer cardigan pocket. She told him she would handle it. She told him to just make sure the paperwork was airtight because she did not want any legal issues when the time came. I froze. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. I pressed pause on the video. The image of my wife, the woman who had kissed my cheek that very morning, remained frozen on the screen as a willing accomplice to my poisoning. 45 years. We built this life together. We marched for civil rights in our youth. We survived recessions. To see her trade our shared history for whatever Trent was promising her was a betrayal so deep it felt physical. For the past 2 weeks, I had been experiencing strange symptoms. My memory felt foggy. I was losing my train of thought mid-sentence. But the most alarming part was my hands. They had started trembling, a fine, persistent tremor that made holding a fork or buttoning my shirt a frustrating chore. Vivian had been playing the role of the deeply concerned wife perfectly. She had held my shaking hands, her eyes wide with fake sympathy, suggesting that maybe it was time we saw a neurologist. She told me it was just my age catching up to me. 70 is not the new 50, Clarence, she had said, stroking my back. We need to face reality. But the reality was sitting right there on my laptop screen. It was not age. It was not a degenerative disease. It was poison. I suddenly understood exactly why Trent was doing this. I own a prime commercial real estate parcel in downtown Atlanta. I bought it for pennies back in the 80s when nobody wanted it. Today, developers would kill for it. They call it the legacy block. It is worth tens of millions of dollars. Trent has been salivating over my property since the day he married Maya. He has pitched me dozens of joint ventures, and I shot every single one of them down because I know his business model is built on smoke and mirrors. Now I understood his desperation. If I would not give it to him willingly, he was going to take it by force by making the world believe my mind was gone. I looked down at my desk. Sitting right next to my mouse pad was the ceramic mug I had used for my morning coffee. I always leave a little bit at the bottom. I slowly raised my hands and held them out in front of me. They were trembling slightly. For 14 days, I had been drinking my own mental destruction served to me with a warm smile by the woman who slept next to me every night. A profound, suffocating silence wrapped around me. A lesser man might have screamed. A lesser man might have stormed into the master bedroom, shaken his wife awake, and demanded answers. I wanted to. Every fiber of my being wanted to kick down the door and confront her. But I did not survive decades in the IRS by losing my temper. I survived by building airtight cases. They thought they were dealing with a senile old man whose brain was turning to mush. They forgot who I used to be. They forgot that before I was a wealthy retiree, I was the man who tore down million-dollar financial empires with nothing but a calculator and a keen eye for deceit. I reached out my trembling fingers, steadying just enough to grab a small plastic Ziploc bag from my desk drawer. I carefully poured the remaining few drops of cold, dark coffee from my mug into the bag. I sealed it tight. Tomorrow I was going to pay a visit to an old friend who ran a private toxicology lab. Vivian and Trent wanted to play a game of shadows. They wanted to steal my mind and my legacy, but they had just handed the rulebook to a master. I closed the laptop. The blue light vanished, leaving me in the pitch-black office. The tremors in my hands were still there, but my mind had never been clearer. They wanted a war over my wealth, but they were about to get a masterclass in total destruction. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of our dining room just like it had for the last 2 decades in this house. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning in Atlanta. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table wearing my robe reading the morning paper. From the kitchen I could hear the familiar sounds of my wife preparing our breakfast. The clinking of porcelain, the soft hum of the coffee maker, and the gentle melody of a gospel song she always hummed when she was in a good mood. For 45 years those sounds meant comfort. They meant home. But today that sweet gospel hum sounded like the soundtrack to my own funeral. I kept my eyes glued to the newspaper, but my mind was completely focused on the kitchen. I knew exactly what she was doing in there. I pictured her carefully taking that small, dark vial from her pocket, unscrewing the cap and counting out 3 drops into my black coffee. I wondered what ran through her mind in that moment. Did her hand tremble? Did she feel even a fraction of guilt? Or was she just thinking about the designer dresses and the luxury vacations Trent had promised her once I was out of the picture and locked away in a memory care ward? A few minutes later, Vivian walked into the dining room. She was wearing a pristine white blouse, her hair perfectly styled, looking like the loving, devoted matriarch our community thought she was. She carried a steaming ceramic mug in her hand and set it down gently on the coaster right next to my newspaper. "Here you go, my love," she said, her voice dripping with that smooth, southern warmth she had perfected over the years. "Drink it while it is hot. It will wake you right up." I looked up from my paper and gave her a tired, gentle smile. The kind of smile an aging husband gives the woman taking care of him. "Thank you, Vivian," I mumbled, letting my voice sound a little weaker, a little more raspy than usual. She stood there leaning against the back of the empty chair next to me, watching me intently. Usually she would go back to the kitchen to fix her own plate, but today she lingered. She wanted to watch me drink it. She needed to make sure the dose was administered. The anticipation in her eyes was practically vibrating. I reached out slowly toward the mug. I commanded my hand to shake. It was not difficult to fake the tremor I had already been experiencing for 2 weeks thanks to her previous doses. My fingers trembled violently as they neared the handle of the mug. I let my hand knock clumsily against the side of the heavy ceramic cup. The mug tipped over instantly. Hot, dark coffee flooded across the polished mahogany table and spilled heavily onto the expensive Persian rug beneath my chair. "Oh no," I stammered, pulling my hands back and looking at the mess with wide, frightened eyes. "I am so sorry, Vivian. My hand just gave out. I do not know what is wrong with me lately. I expected her to do what any loving wife of 45 years would do. I expected her to rush to my side, grab a napkin, ask if I had burned myself, and tell me not to worry about the rug. But the mask slipped. Vivian gasped, her body going rigid. Her hands curled into fists at her sides and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "What is wrong with you, Clarence?" She snapped, her voice sharp and vicious, echoing loudly in the quiet dining room. "Look what you did! You wasted it! You spilled the whole cup!" She was not looking at the stained antique table. She was not looking at the ruined $1,000 rug. She was staring at the puddle of coffee as if I had just dumped liquid gold onto the floor. Her breathing was heavy and the veins in her neck stood out. The sheer panic and frustration of missing a dose had shattered her sweet facade completely. "I am sorry," I whispered, shrinking back into my chair, playing the role of the confused and intimidated old man to perfection. "I just cannot control the shaking, Vivian. I did not mean to waste it." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, clearly trying to rein in her temper and remember the role she was supposed to be playing. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, forcing a tight, unnatural smile. "It is fine, Clarence. Do not move. I will clean it up. I will brew a fresh pot and make you another cup right now. You really need your morning coffee." She turned on her heel and practically sprinted toward the kitchen to fetch the cleaning supplies and undoubtedly a fresh cup with a fresh dose of poison. As soon as she disappeared around the corner, my posture changed. The trembling old man vanished, and the retired IRS fraud investigator took over. I looked down at the puddle soaking into the carpet. They thought I was just some lucky old fool who did not understand the value of what he possessed. They were wrong. I am not just a retired government worker living on a pension. Back in the 1980s, when downtown Atlanta was struggling and nobody wanted to invest in those forgotten neighborhoods, I took every penny I had saved and bought up a massive block of dilapidated commercial properties. It took grit. It took dealing with banks that did not want to lend to a black man, and it took decades of patience. Today, that property is known in the real estate world as the Legacy Block. It sits right in the heart of the city, surrounded by billion-dollar developments. It is worth over $30 million, and I own it free and clear. Trent, my arrogant white son-in-law, had been salivating over the Legacy Block since the day he started dating Maya. He is a real estate developer who builds those soulless glass mega condos for the ultra-rich. He had been begging me for years to sign the land over to his company, promising me a cut of the profits for a massive luxury high-rise project he wanted to build. But I knew his track record. I knew he was over-leveraged and sloppy. I told him no every single time. He could not handle the rejection. To a guy like Trent, a black man from the old neighborhood, holding on to the most valuable piece of real estate in the city was an insult to his ego. He needed my land to save his failing business, and since I would not hand him the keys, he and my wife decided to steal my mind to get them. I listened to the sound of Vivian rummaging under the kitchen sink. I had less than 30 seconds. I reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out a small, thick sponge I had hidden there earlier and a sterile plastic Ziploc bag. I bent down quickly and pressed the sponge hard into the wettest part of the Persian rug, letting it soak up the dark, poisoned coffee. I tossed the saturated sponge into the Ziploc bag, pressed the air out, sealed it tight, and slipped it back into my deep pocket. By the time Vivian marched back into the dining room carrying a roll of paper towels and a spray bottle, I was sitting perfectly still, staring blankly at the wall, playing the lost old man. Here she muttered, kneeling down to scrub the rug, her movements aggressive and impatient. "The new pot is brewing. I will bring you a fresh cup in a minute. You are not leaving this table until you drink it." "Actually, Vivian," I said slowly, standing up from my chair and leaning heavily on the table for support, "I think I have lost my appetite. My stomach is feeling a little upset. I think I just need to get out of the house for a bit. Get some fresh air." She stood up quickly, her eyes flashing with panic. "No, Clarence, you cannot go out right now. You are not thinking clearly. You need your coffee. You need to sit down." I shuffled past her, ignoring her demands. "I am just going to take a slow drive," I mumbled, grabbing my car keys from the hook by the door. "I will be back in a few hours. Do not worry about me." She called after me, her voice rising in desperation. But I was already out the door. I climbed into my car, locking the doors behind me. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Vivian standing on the porch, her face twisted in rage, clutching a roll of paper towels. She had missed her window today. I did not drive to the park. I did not go for a slow, aimless ride. As soon as I was out of our neighborhood, I straightened my posture, my grip on the steering wheel firm and steady. I merged onto the highway, heading straight for downtown Atlanta. I was going to see an old friend, a man named Marcus who ran a private independent forensic toxicology lab. We used to work together back in my IRS days, building financial profiles on drug cartels. If anyone could tell me exactly what chemical cocktail Trent had given my wife to destroy my brain, it was him. Vivian and Trent thought they were playing a game of real estate and inheritance. They thought they could erase me from my own life and take the empire I built with my bare hands. But as I merged into the fast lane, feeling the heavy plastic bag resting in my pocket, I knew their game was already over. I was going to let them dig their graves a little deeper, and then I was going to bury them both. I left Marcus at the toxicology lab with a promise that he would rush the chemical screen on the coffee sample. I had a few hours to kill before the results came back. I could have gone to a park to clear my head. I could have gone to the police. Instead, I picked up my phone and called my daughter Maya. I needed to look her in the eye. I needed to know if the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders was a hostage in her own marriage or a willing participant in my execution. We agreed to meet for lunch at an overpriced bistro in Buckhead, a place where a salad costs $50 and everyone is pretending to be richer than they actually are. It was exactly Maya's kind of place. She walked in 20 minutes late. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere coat and carrying a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. She looked beautiful. She looked just like her mother, and right then that resemblance sent a cold shiver down my spine. She sat down across from me, barely looking up from her phone as she offered a quick, distracted apology about traffic. I looked at her and saw a 35-year-old woman completely consumed by the illusion of high society, a lifestyle financed entirely by Trent's house of cards. I ordered a black coffee and kept my hands on the table, making sure she could see the slight tremor in my fingers. I slumped my shoulders forward, letting the fatigue of the last 24 hours show on my face. I told her I needed to talk to her about some things. Important things. She finally put her phone face down on the table, but her eyes were already impatient. She asked what it was, sighing as if my very existence was an inconvenience on her busy schedule. I told her that I had not been feeling like myself lately. I told her my memory was slipping, that I was forgetting names and misplacing things around the house. I watched her face closely for any sign of genuine panic, any daughterly instinct to reach across the table and comfort her aging father. There was none. Her eyes just darted quickly to my trembling hands and then back to my face. She looked analytical, not devastated. She told me I was getting older, and her voice was completely devoid of warmth. She said that Vivian and I just needed to accept that we cannot manage everything on our own anymore. I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat and leaned closer. I spent decades as an auditor for the IRS. I know how to read people when they are hiding money, and I know how to read them when they are hiding guilt. I told her that was exactly why I asked her here. I said I was meeting with my lawyer next week to finalize my will. I told her I wanted to transfer the legacy block entirely to her. Her eyes lit up instantly. The boredom vanished, replaced by a sharp, hungry gleam. The legacy block was the crown jewel, the $30 million safety net Trent was desperate to sink his teeth into. But there is a condition. I continued, my voice firming up just a fraction. I told her I was putting the property into an ironclad trust. I said she would be the sole beneficiary, but Trent would have zero legal authority over it. I made it very clear that his name would not be on the deed. He could not leverage it, he could not develop it, and he could not use it as collateral for his company. I told her I wanted this to remain in our bloodline, just her. The transformation was immediate and chilling. Maya stiffened. The greedy excitement in her eyes morphed into sudden defensive anger. She immediately reached for her phone, sliding it off the table and onto her lap, out of my line of sight. I could see her thumbs moving frantically under the table. She was texting him. She was warning her husband that the old man was trying to lock him out of the gold mine. She snapped at me, entirely abandoning the facade of a caring daughter. She asked why I would deliberately exclude Trent since he was her husband. I kept my expression perfectly confused, playing the role of the paranoid old man. I told her I did not trust the way he does business. I said he builds too fast and borrows too much. I reminded her that I built that property block by block, and I just wanted to protect her. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded exactly like my wife Vivian. She told me I was not thinking clearly. She said I was clearly confused and losing my grip on reality. She leaned across the table and passionately defended the man who was currently poisoning my breakfast. She called Trent a financial genius. She said he has a vision for downtown Atlanta that I just do not understand. She insisted that letting him manage the legacy block is what is best for our family's future because he could multiply its value in a year. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that holding onto my land out of some stubborn, old-fashioned pride was just holding them back. Us. She said us. But she did not mean me and her mother. She meant her and Trent. I sat there looking at the woman I had raised. I had paid for her college. I had walked her down the aisle. I had given her everything. But as I watched her fiercely defend a white man who was drowning in debt, a man who was actively trying to erase my existence, I realized the devastating truth. Maya was not a victim of Trent's manipulation. She was his shield. She might not know about the poison in my coffee, but she knew he was after my assets, and she was perfectly fine with him taking them as long as it kept her in cashmere coats and luxury cars. She was perfectly willing to let her father be labeled mentally incompetent if it meant her husband could finally cash the check. Just as she was launching into another rehearsed speech about Trent's real estate brilliance, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I slowly pulled it out. It was a text message from Marcus at the toxicology lab. I opened it, keeping my trembling hands steady enough to read the short clinical sentences. The results were in. The message read that the coffee sample contained high concentrations of haloperidol. Marcus explained it is a heavy-duty antipsychotic medication normally used to treat severe schizophrenia and acute delirium. It is not a mild sedative. In those doses, it is a chemical lobotomy. He wrote that it causes severe tremors, memory loss, and cognitive paralysis. Whoever was giving me this was not trying to calm me down. They were trying to destroy my brain. His final words on the screen told me to get out of that house immediately. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The words burned into my retinas. A chemical lobotomy. My wife was poisoning me. My son-in-law supplied the weapon, and my daughter, the only child I had in this world, was sitting across from me, eagerly paving the road for them to steal my legacy. She was annoyed that I was not declining fast enough. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at Maya, who was still texting under the table, probably assuring Trent that she could handle the confused old man. I was completely alone. The family I had spent a lifetime building was nothing but a pack of wolves waiting for me to bleed out. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that wolves are not the only dangerous things in the dark. I smiled at my daughter, a cold, dead smile that she was too busy looking at her phone to notice. I told her softly that she might be right. I said maybe I am just a confused old man, and maybe Trent does know what is best for the family. I told her to enjoy her lunch. I walked out of the restaurant, stepping into the bright Atlanta sun. The heartbreak was gone. It had burned away completely, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated focus. I was officially a man without a family. But I was also a man with a $30 million loaded gun, and I was about to pull the trigger. I drove away from that Buckhead bistro with a clarity I had not felt in years. My wife was poisoning me, and my daughter was handing over the shovel to dig my grave. I did not go back to that house of lies. Instead, I drove to a quiet public library on the south side of town. It was a neighborhood where nobody knew me and nobody would look for me. I needed a secure internet connection and a quiet corner to do what I do best. I walked past the rows of dusty books and found an isolated table near the back. For 35 years at the Internal Revenue Service, I did not carry a gun. My weapon was a calculator and an unparalleled ability to read the stories that people try to hide inside their tax returns and corporate filings. I hunted down corporate embezzlers, corrupt politicians, and men who thought they were smarter than the system. I spent decades putting arrogant men behind bars because they believed their expensive suits made them invisible to the law. Trent thought I was just an obsolete old black man sitting on a gold mine he deserved to own. He was about to find out that he had picked a fight with an apex predator. I opened my laptop and connected to the public network. I cracked my knuckles, feeling the slight persistent tremor from the haloperidol coursing through my veins, but I pushed through it. My body might have been under chemical attack, but the mind driving those hands was razor sharp. I started pulling public records on Trent and his company Vanguard Real Estate Solutions. On the surface, Trent painted the perfect picture of a modern visionary. His social media was full of pictures of him in custom-tailored suits, standing in front of glass high-rises, holding champagne flutes with city officials and smiling investors. He talked a big game about revolutionizing the Atlanta skyline and bringing generational wealth to his partners. My wife Vivian, consumed by her desperate desire to be part of the high society elite, bought into his illusion completely. She looked at Trent and saw the country club lifestyle she always felt she had been denied. But numbers do not have egos. Numbers do not wear Armani suits or drive imported sports cars. Numbers only tell the cold, hard truth. I started digging deeply into the public land registries, the state business databases, and the Uniform Commercial Code filings. I tracked the limited liability companies he had set up for every single one of his development projects. It is a standard practice in commercial real estate to separate liabilities, but Trent had created a labyrinth of shell companies that practically screamed financial desperation. It took me 3 solid hours of relentless auditing to untangle his web of deceit. I pulled a massive favor from a trusted old colleague still working down at the federal building, asking him to run a quick background query on some of the private equity groups Trent was associated with. When the data came back, the picture painted by the spreadsheets was absolutely catastrophic. Trent was not a real estate genius. He was a complete fraud. His entire empire was built on a fragile foundation of sand and stolen promises. I traced the money flowing between his various shell companies. When funding for his new luxury condo project on Peachtree Street dried up, he secretly diverted investor capital from a different unfinished townhouse development to cover the massive shortfall. When the townhouse investors started demanding their returns, he took out massive high-interest loans from predatory private equity firms to pay them off. He was simply moving money from one sinking ship to another. It was a classic textbook Ponzi scheme, and the music was finally about to stop. I added up the outstanding liabilities across all his active projects, comparing them against his actual liquid assets. The final number stared back at me from the laptop screen, glowing like a red warning beacon in the dark. $25 million. Trent was $25 million in the red. His creditors were not just traditional banks who would simply foreclose on a property and politely write off the loss. He owed millions to aggressive shadow lenders and unregulated equity firms, the kind of people who do not just ruin your credit score, they ruin your life and take everything you have ever touched. He was drowning, and the water was rising fast. If he did not secure a massive injection of capital within the next 30 days, his entire corporate structure would collapse completely. He would face federal indictments for wire fraud, embezzlement, and investor deception. He was staring down the barrel of a 20-year prison sentence in a federal penitentiary. Suddenly, the dark glass vial of poison made perfect, terrifying sense. It was never just about typical corporate greed. It was about pure animal desperation. My property, the Legacy Block, was valued at over $30 million, and I owned it free and clear without a single cent of debt. To a man drowning in $25 million of toxic loans, my land was the ultimate life preserver. If he could somehow use the Legacy Block as collateral, he could secure a massive institutional loan, pay off the shadow lenders, and keep his Ponzi scheme breathing for another few years. But as long as I was of sound mind, I would never let him touch the deed. I had rejected him too many times. He needed me declared mentally incompetent so my wife Vivian could assume total legal control through a medical power of attorney. Vivian, blinded by his charm and her own greed, would gladly sign the property over to her sophisticated son-in-law, believing she was making a brilliant investment. They were trying to trade my sanity for his salvation. I leaned back in the hard wooden library chair, letting the sheer magnitude of his failure wash over me. Trent was pathetic. But as I continued to scroll through the property records looking for any other assets he might be hiding, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run completely cold. I pulled up the deed and the financial history of the sprawling suburban mansion where Trent and my daughter Maya lived. When they bought that house 5 years ago, Trent bragged to our entire family that he had paid for it in cash. He threw a lavish housewarming party claiming it was a testament to his unstoppable success. Maya had paraded her friends through the marble halls acting like she had married the king of Atlanta, but the public registry told a completely different story. Trent had not paid in cash. He had taken out a massive primary mortgage to secure the property. But that was not the worst part. Looking at the recent financial filings, I saw that over the past 8 months, as his Ponzi scheme began to rapidly unravel, Trent had secretly taken out a second and then a third mortgage against the house. He had leveraged their home to the absolute maximum limit, drawing out every single drop of equity to throw into the black hole of his failing business. The house was currently in pre-foreclosure status. He was 3 months behind on his mortgage payments. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with a sickening realization. Maya did not know. During our lunch, she had passionately defended his financial brilliance. She truly believed she was living the dream of a wealthy, invincible socialite. She had no idea that the marble floors she proudly walked on were essentially owned by aggressive debt collectors, and that she was one missed payment away from being thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. Trent knew exactly what he was doing. He had silently gambled away the roof over his own wife's head. He had stripped her of her financial security to save his own skin. He was perfectly willing to let Maya become a collateral casualty in his massive financial collapse. He was sacrificing his own wife to buy himself a little more time. And Maya, my foolish, blinded daughter, was actively helping him destroy me, the only man who could have actually protected her from the storm that was coming. I closed my laptop, sliding it carefully into my leather briefcase. The circle of betrayal was completely unbroken. My wife wanted to poison me for a taste of luxury she felt she deserved. My son-in-law wanted to chemically lobotomize me to cover up his federal crimes and avoid a prison cell. And my daughter was defending the very man who was quietly leading her to the slaughterhouse. I stood up and walked out of the library, stepping into the warm Georgia afternoon. I was a man surrounded by enemies disguised as a loving family, but they had made a fatal error. They thought they had backed a helpless old man into a corner. They did not realize they had just handed a loaded weapon to a veteran IRS investigator who knew exactly how to pull the trigger. Trent wanted to play with financial fire. It was time for me to burn his entire world to the ground. I drove back to the house we had shared for over 4 decades. The large driveway was completely empty. Vivian had mentioned that morning she was attending a charity luncheon with some of the wealthy wives from the neighborhood. A charity luncheon paid for by the same man she was actively trying to destroy. I walked through the front door. The grand foyer with its high ceilings and imported marble floors no longer felt like a home. It felt like a crime scene waiting to happen. The silence of the house was heavy and suffocating. I did not waste any time. I went straight up the sweeping staircase and into our master bedroom. Vivian had a personal heavy steel safe hidden in the back of her massive walk-in closet, tucked carefully behind a row of expensive designer shoeboxes. She always thought she was so clever, keeping the digital code a secret from me. She used the date of our wedding anniversary. I suppose she thought there was some twisted poetic justice in protecting her darkest secrets with the exact day we swore before God to be faithful to each other. I punched the numbers into the keypad. The heavy metal door clicked open with a soft mechanical thud. I reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder I had never seen before. I walked over and sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, opening the flap. My heart beat a slow and steady rhythm against my ribs. I was not a heartbroken husband anymore. I was an investigator processing evidence. The first document inside was printed on the thick, expensive letterhead of a private boutique medical clinic located in the wealthiest part of Buckhead. I read the name printed boldly at the top of the page, Dr. Arthur Vance. He was a high-end concierge physician known for catering to the city elite. I read the medical evaluation carefully, reading every single clinical term. It was a comprehensive assessment of my mental and physical health. According to Dr. Vance, I was suffering from rapid-onset Lewy body dementia and severe, unrecoverable cognitive decline. The report stated in cold professional language that I was prone to violent outbursts, frequent memory lapses, and a complete inability to manage my own basic daily needs. The report concluded that I required immediate full-time institutionalized care for my own safety. The medical report was officially dated 3 days ago. I had never met Dr. Arthur Vance in my entire life. I had never stepped foot inside his luxury clinic. Trent had clearly bought himself a dirty doctor, a man willing to trade his medical license and his integrity for a fat envelope of untraceable cash. They were building an airtight paper trail of my insanity without me ever sitting in a waiting room. I flipped to the second document in the folder and the air completely left my lungs. It was a comprehensive, durable financial power of attorney. I read the legal jargon carefully. This document gave Vivian absolute and total control over every single bank account, investment portfolio, and piece of real estate in my name. It specifically, explicitly included the right to transfer, sell, or use the legacy block as collateral for commercial business loans. It gave my wife the absolute legal power to sign my life away to her son-in-law. I looked down at the bottom of the last page. There on the designated signature line was my name. It was written in dark black ink. I brought the paper closer to my eyes and stared at it. It was a remarkably good forgery. It had the slight forward slant of my cursive and the sharp, aggressive loop on the capital letter C. An amateur would never question it. But 35 years of auditing tax returns and corporate filings had trained my eyes to spot the hesitation in a fraudulent pen stroke. I could see where the pen had lingered just a fraction of a second too long. The ink pressure was completely wrong. Trent must have spent hours sitting at his desk tracing over my old checks, practicing my handwriting over and over again until he felt confident enough to commit a massive federal crime. Right next to my fake signature was a small blank space waiting for a notary public stamp. I stared at that empty space, and the entire scope of their timeline clicked into place. That blank circle was the missing piece of their puzzle. A legal notary cannot stamp a document of this magnitude without the person being physically present of sound mind or completely incapacitated by a documented medical emergency. That is exactly why Vivian was rushing the haloperidol drops in my morning coffee. They needed the poison to finally push my body over the physical edge. They needed me to collapse in the living room, to be rushed to an emergency room, babbling, shaking, and completely incoherent. Once I was strapped to a hospital bed, legally documented by attending nurses as a danger to myself, they could bring in a corrupt notary on Trent's payroll to stamp the document and seal my fate. They were literally just waiting for my brain to short-circuit so they could steal $30 million. A wave of pure violent anger washed over my entire body. My hands curled into tight fists, crushing the edges of the thick legal paper. My initial primal instinct was to tear the documents into 1,000 pieces. I wanted to march downstairs, throw them in the fireplace, and watch their master plan burn to ash. I wanted to sit in the living room, wait for Vivian to walk through the front door and throw those ashes directly into her face. I wanted to watch the color drain from her cheeks when she realized her grand scheme was destroyed. But anger makes a man sloppy. Anger makes you impulsive. If I destroyed the papers, Trent would just print new ones. If I confronted Vivian, she would instantly deny it, play the victim, and accelerate their timeline. They would realize I was on to them, and they would find another way to get me out of the picture. A faster way. A more violent way. I took a deep, ragged breath, forcing the furious husband back down and pulling the cold, calculating IRS auditor back to the surface. I smoothed out the wrinkled edges of the forged documents, pressing them flat against the mattress. I gathered the papers and walked swiftly to my home office. I turned on my high-resolution document scanner. I placed the fake medical diagnosis from the dirty doctor flat on the glass and scanned it. I placed the forged power of attorney with my fake signature on the glass and scanned it. I saved the high-definition digital copies to an encrypted offshore cloud server that Vivian did not even know existed. I printed one physical copy of everything and locked it inside a hidden compartment in my desk. I took the original fraudulent documents and walked quietly back to the master bedroom. I placed the pages carefully back inside the manila folder. I arranged the folder exactly how I had found it, sliding it perfectly into the back of the heavy metal safe. I closed the thick steel door and spun the combination dial. The lock clicked shut, securing their treason back in the dark. I pushed the designer shoeboxes back into their precise original positions, leaving absolutely no trace that I had ever been there. I walked downstairs into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of ice-cold water. My hands were perfectly steady holding the glass. The heavy doses of haloperidol were slowly working their way out of my system, but I knew I had to keep up the grand performance. Tomorrow morning, I would have to sit at the dining room table and let Vivian pour me my poisoned coffee. I would have to pretend to take sips when she was looking and discreetly spit the liquid into a hidden napkin when she turned her back. I would have to force my hands to shake. I would have to stare blankly at the walls and pretend I forgot what day it was. I had to make them believe with absolute certainty that their toxic poison was working flawlessly. Vivian and Trent thought they had trapped a weak, dying animal. They thought they were holding all the winning cards in this high-stakes game. But they had just handed me the physical, tangible proof of their federal crimes. That forged power of attorney was not their golden ticket to a $30 million real estate fortune. It was their one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. The trap was fully set, and I was holding the cage door wide open, waiting patiently for them to walk right in. The cat and mouse game had officially begun. But as I stood in the quiet kitchen looking at the empty coffee pot, I smiled, because they had absolutely no idea who the cat really was. I drove down to Sweet Auburn the next morning. It is a part of Atlanta that holds deep history for our people, the kind of history that arrogant men like Trent try to pave over with glass and steel. I parked my car in front of a modest brick building that looked like it had not changed since the 1970s. Inside was the law office of Marcus. Marcus and I grew up together in the same tough neighborhoods. We survived the civil rights movement together. While I went into the IRS to hunt down financial criminals using numbers and ledgers, Marcus went to law school and became one of the most brilliant and ruthless defense attorneys in the state of Georgia. He did not care about designer suits or exclusive country club memberships. He cared about the law, and he cared about loyalty. I walked into his office, which smelled strongly of old paper and bitter black coffee. I sat down across from his heavy oak desk and I told him everything. I did not hold anything back. I told him about the hidden camera and the poison in my coffee. I told him about the massive $25 million debt Trent was hiding behind his luxury cars and fake smiles. I told him about the dirty doctor and the forged power of attorney sitting right now in my wife's safe. Marcus listened in absolute silence. His dark eyes narrowed and his jaw set like stone. When I finished, he did not offer me empty sympathy or pity. He knew I did not want it. He just pulled a fresh legal pad toward him, leaned forward, and asked me exactly how I wanted to execute the execution. I told him I needed an irrevocable trust, and I needed it drafted and filed immediately. For those who do not understand complex property law, an irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like. It is a legal vault. Once you place an asset inside it, you surrender your direct legal ownership of that asset forever. The trust becomes the absolute owner, and a designated trustee manages it. You cannot change your mind later, and nobody can force you to dissolve it. I told Marcus to draw up the papers transferring the entire $30 million legacy block out of my personal name and into the newly formed Vance Family Legacy Trust. I named Marcus as the sole managing trustee. By the time I signed my name at the bottom of that heavy stack of legal documents, the legacy block officially ceased to belong to Clarence. It was a massive legal ghost, and that meant the forged power of attorney Trent and Vivian were holding was now completely and utterly worthless. You cannot use a power of attorney to seize an asset that the person no longer owns. Trent was preparing to rob a bank vault that I had just quietly emptied. Marcus stamped the heavy seal on the trust documents and looked at me with a grim, satisfied smile. He told me the property was locked down tighter than a Federal Reserve. He said it was time to let them hang themselves. I left his office and drove back to my house in the sprawling suburbs. The legal trap was perfectly set, but I needed to keep the physical trap wide open. I needed them to believe they were winning this twisted game. That meant I had to return to my own home and put on the performance of a lifetime. The haloperidol was still in my house, and I knew Vivian was still slipping it into my drinks every single chance she got. I continued my daily routine with extreme caution. I took the cups of coffee and glasses of water she handed me, and I discreetly dumped the liquid down the bathroom sink or absorbed it into a thick sponge I kept hidden deep in my pocket. But my body had to show the symptoms they were expecting. I had to become the ghost they wanted me to be. That evening, I walked into the living room to deliver my grand performance. I made sure to wear my left house slipper and a right leather dress shoe. I shuffled my feet heavily, dragging my heels across the expensive hardwood floor, making a pathetic scraping sound. Vivian was sitting on the sofa, flipping through a luxury home magazine, probably picking out the new imported Italian furniture she planned to buy with my life savings. I stood in the middle of the room and looked around with wide, empty eyes. I let my jaw go slack and allowed my hands to tremble violently at my sides. I looked directly at Vivian and let my face register complete, terrifying confusion. I stared at the woman I had slept next to for 45 years, and I asked her who she was. I asked her what she was doing sitting in my house. I watched the woman I married look at me with absolute chilling coldness. She did not drop her magazine in shock. She did not rush over to comfort her sick husband. She did not ask if I was feeling okay or offer to call an ambulance. Instead, a slow, triumphant smirk spread across her face. Her eyes lit up with pure, greedy validation. She picked up her phone from the glass coffee table. She did not even try to hide what she was doing. Her thumbs moved rapidly across the screen. I knew exactly who she was texting. She was telling Trent that the poison had finally broken my brain. She was telling him that the great Clarence was gone and that it was time to finalize their master plan. I stood there playing the broken, helpless old man while she gleefully reported my mental death to her son-in-law right in front of my face. It took every single ounce of discipline I had learned in my 35 years as a federal investigator not to drop the act. I wanted to stand up straight, stop the trembling, and show her the absolute monster she had just awakened. But I swallowed my pride and kept shuffling my feet, playing the fool. Later that night, when the house was completely silent and Vivian was fast asleep, dreaming of her stolen millions, I went back into my dark home office. I booted up my encrypted laptop. I had spent the last 2 days compiling a massive, comprehensive digital dossier on Vanguard Real Estate Solutions. I had Trent's bank routing numbers. I had the precise details of his offshore shell companies. I had the digital transfer logs showing him moving money from new investors to desperately pay off the old ones. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme documented with flawless federal precision. I had mapped out his $25 million fraud so clearly that a first-year accounting student could secure a conviction. I printed all 200 pages of the financial evidence. The printer hummed quietly in the dark, spitting out page after page of Trent's absolute ruin. I packed the thick stack of papers into a heavy, unmarked manila envelope. I did not put a return address on it. I slipped out the back door of my house into the cool Georgia night air. I drove my car 2 towns over, making sure I was completely out of my neighborhood. I pulled up to a blue postal drop box sitting under a flickering street lamp. The envelope was addressed directly to the regional director of the FBI field office in Atlanta. I also included a carbon copy package destined for the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, my old division. I knew the men who would open that package. I trained some of them. I knew they did not ignore a perfectly wrapped financial crime, especially when it involved $25 million in federal wire fraud and blatant investor deception. I pushed the thick envelope through the metal slot of the mailbox. It dropped into the bin with a heavy, satisfying thud. The irrevocable trust would protect my legacy and keep my property out of their blood-stained hands. My daily acting performance would keep them blind and confident, and the federal government would handle the rest. I drove back home in the dead of night, ready to play the dying man one last time. Trent and Vivian thought they were speeding toward the finish line of a brilliant heist. They had no idea they were driving straight toward the edge of a cliff, and I had just cut the brakes. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 p.m. on a gloomy Thursday. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television screen. Vivian was hovering nearby, wiping imaginary dust off the mantel. She had spent the entire morning cleaning the house, making sure everything looked absolutely perfect for our special guest. She was dressed in a conservative beige dress, looking every bit the exhausted but devoted wife. The performance was nauseating. Trent walked through the front door a few moments later, ushering in a man who looked less like a medical professional and more like a high-priced defense attorney. This was Dr. Arthur Carter, the man whose signature was currently sitting on a forged medical evaluation in my wife's hidden safe. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch that caught the afternoon light. He did not carry a traditional medical bag. He only carried a sleek leather briefcase. I did not turn my head when they entered the room. I kept my eyes fixed on the television, letting a thin string of drool gather at the corner of my mouth. I let my left hand tremble violently against the armrest of the chair. I was 70 years old, a black man who had spent his entire life building a legacy from the ground up, and here I was forcing my own body to mimic the devastating decay of the human mind just to survive the people who claimed to love me. Dr. Carter walked over and stood in front of my chair. He did not bend down to meet my eyes. He looked down at me with an expression of complete indifference. He did not see a human being. He saw a transaction. He saw a down payment on a new sports car or a luxury vacation. "Well, let us take a look at him," Carter said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of any real medical concern. Vivian immediately rushed to his side, placing a hand over her mouth, acting as if she were holding back a flood of tears. She told him that I had been getting worse every single day. She said I was wandering the halls at night, forgetting my own name and becoming agitated over nothing. She deserved an Academy Award for the sheer conviction in her voice. Carter pulled a pen from his pocket and finally knelt down in front of me. He asked me if I knew what day it was. He asked me who the president was. I slowly turned my head to look at him. I made sure my eyes were completely vacant, devoid of any spark or recognition. I let my jaw hang loose. I mumbled something incomprehensible, slurring my words together until they sounded like a foreign language. I reached out with my trembling hand and batted weakly at the air in front of his face as if I were chasing a ghost. Trent stood leaning against the door frame of the living room, his arms crossed over his chest. He was watching the entire spectacle with a smug, satisfied smirk. He was enjoying this. He was actively getting a thrill out of watching the man who had rejected his business proposals for 5 years reduced to a babbling shell of a human being. Carter did not take my blood pressure. He did not check my pupil dilation with a light. He did not perform a single legitimate cognitive test. He simply stood back up, smoothed out the wrinkles in his expensive suit pants, and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He turned to Vivian and put a hand on her shoulder, giving her a look of profound, fake sympathy. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed compassion. "It is exactly as I feared. The cognitive decline is severe and irreversible. He is suffering from late-stage dementia. It is no longer safe for him to be managing his own affairs or living without round-the-clock institutional care." Vivian let out a dramatic sob, burying her face in her hands. Trent walked over and put his arm around his mother-in-law, playing the role of the strong, supportive rock of the family. He asked the doctor what the next legal steps were. He asked it so casually, as if they had not already rehearsed this exact conversation a dozen times before. Carter opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of official-looking medical documents. They were identical to the ones I had already scanned and hidden away. He placed them on the glass coffee table right in front of me. He uncapped his expensive fountain pen. He did not even bother to take the paperwork into another room. He leaned over the table and signed his name on the dotted line, officially and legally declaring me mentally incompetent right in front of my face. He smiled a nasty, arrogant little smirk as he handed the signed psychiatric evaluation to Trent. "It is done," he said quietly. "You can take this directly to a judge to expedite the power of attorney and the facility placement. Just make sure the final payments are routed to the offshore account we discussed." Trent took the papers, folding them carefully and slipping them into his jacket pocket. He walked over to my armchair. He leaned down, putting his face inches from mine. I could smell the expensive mint cologne on his breath. He reached out and patted my shoulder with heavy, condescending strikes. "It is okay, Dad," he whispered, his voice laced with pure, venomous victory. "Do not you worry about a thing anymore. We are going to take real good care of your assets from now on. You just rest." I looked up at him, keeping my eyes wide and vacant, letting my hand continue to shake against the leather armrest. He thought he was looking at a broken man. He thought he had just successfully stolen $30 million of prime Atlanta real estate. He thought he had won the game. But Trent did not realize that I am a man who spent 35 years hunting criminals who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I never walk into a room unequipped. I looked down at my chest. Sewn perfectly into the fabric of my cardigan, completely indistinguishable from the other ordinary brown buttons, was a state-of-the-art micro camera. I had purchased it from a specialized surveillance boutique downtown using untraceable cash. It had a wide-angle lens and a highly sensitive audio receiver. Trent and Vivian thought the examination in the living room was the final act of their brilliant play, but they had made a catastrophic error 10 minutes earlier. When Trent first answered the front door to let Dr. Carter inside, Vivian was still in the kitchen fetching water. Trent and Carter had lingered in the grand foyer for a full 2 minutes. I was sitting right here in my armchair facing the hallway with a direct, unobstructed view of the front door. My little button camera had been silently recording in crystal-clear, high-definition video as Trent reached into his coat pocket. It had recorded him pulling out a thick white envelope bulging with $100 bills. It had captured the crisp audio of Trent handing the envelope to the doctor, saying, "Here is the second half of the $50,000 we agreed on. Just sign the damn paper and make it look convincing." It had recorded Dr. Carter laughing greedily as he stuffed the bribe into his briefcase before walking into the living room to perform his fake evaluation. I had the entire federal crime documented on a secure digital memory card resting right against my beating heart. Conspiracy to commit medical fraud, bribery, elder abuse. It was a flawless, airtight conviction handed to me on a silver platter. I let out a soft, confused groan, keeping up my senile act as Trent patted my shoulder one last time. "Let them think they have destroyed me," I thought to myself. "Let them sleep peacefully tonight, dreaming of millions they will never touch." Because the evidence I was carrying in my shirt button was going straight to the federal investigators by midnight. They had just dug their own graves and handed me the shovel. With the fraudulent medical evaluation and the forged power of attorney burning a hole in his pocket, Trent did exactly what a drowning man does when he sees a life raft. He lunged for it blindly. He did not even wait to leave my house to start making his moves. As soon as that dirty doctor walked out the front door, Trent practically sprinted into my home office, shutting the heavy mahogany doors behind him. He thought he was securing his privacy. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He had absolutely no idea that a retired IRS fraud investigator never leaves his own command center unprotected. I had tapped my own home network weeks ago. Every single keystroke, every outgoing email, and every phone call that routed through my wireless router was being mirrored directly to a secure offshore server I controlled. I sat in my armchair in the living room, continuing to play the drooling, oblivious old man for my wife, while a hidden earpiece in my left ear fed me the live audio of Trent digging his own grave just one room away. Through the earpiece, I could hear Trent pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. His breathing was heavy, ragged, with a mix of adrenaline and sheer panic. He picked up his phone and dialed an international number. I recognized the country code immediately. It was Switzerland. Trent had completely exhausted all of his domestic credit lines. Every reputable bank in the state of Georgia had already slammed their doors in his face after looking at the toxic wasteland of his financial portfolio. He was completely out of options stateside, so he was reaching out to the shadow markets. He was calling a private European investment group known for providing massive amounts of unregulated capital to desperate real estate developers. They were the kind of predatory lenders who charged extortionate interest rates and required absolute ironclad collateral. I listened as the call connected. Trent put on his best, most arrogant corporate voice. He spoke to a senior managing partner at the fund, explaining that he had just acquired full legal control over the legacy block. He confidently stated that the property was valued at over $30 million, completely unencumbered by any existing debt. He told the European investor that he needed an immediate emergency cash injection of $20 million by the end of the week to break ground on a new luxury high-rise. It was a spectacular lie. He did not want to break ground on anything. He needed that $20 million to pay off the aggressive shadow lenders breathing down his neck and to keep his Ponzi scheme from completely collapsing. Trent emailed them the scanned copies of the forged power of attorney and the fake deed transfers he had drawn up. He was offering my life's work, the property I had sweat blood to secure, as a sacrificial lamb to save his miserable skin. But Trent was playing checkers while I was playing a game he could not even comprehend. My attorney and I had already anticipated this exact move. When we set up the irrevocable trust days earlier, locking the legacy block away from Trent forever, we knew he would try to leverage the fake documents to secure an overseas loan. What Trent did not know was that the senior managing partner of this specific European fund owed my attorney a massive life-saving favor. Years ago, my attorney had helped that same investment group navigate a brutal federal tax evasion audit without going to federal prison. They owed us, and we had called in the marker. I listened intently through my earpiece as the European investor paused, pretending to review Trent's fraudulent documents. Then, following the exact script my attorney had provided him, the investor spoke. He told Trent that the collateral was acceptable. He told him the $20 million could be wired into his corporate accounts by Monday morning. I heard Trent let out a massive, trembling sigh of relief. He actually laughed, thinking he had just pulled off the heist of the century. But then the investor dropped the hammer. He told Trent that a transaction of this magnitude, especially with a new international client, required a gesture of supreme public confidence. The investor noted that Trent's company, Vanguard Real Estate, was hosting its 10-year anniversary gala this coming Saturday night at the Ritz-Carlton. It was going to be the biggest social event of the year, packed with Atlanta's wealthiest elite city politicians and local media. The investor laid down an absolute ultimatum. He said his firm would only finalize the $20 million loan if Trent agreed to hold a formal public signing ceremony during the gala. He demanded that Trent stand up on that stage in front of 500 high-profile guests and publicly announce the acquisition of the legacy block and the partnership with the European fund. It was a brilliant, flawless trap. We were forcing Trent to commit his massive federal fraud in the most public, highly documented way possible. He would not be signing these forged documents in the shadows of some back alley. He would be doing it under the bright, flashing lights of the press, surrounded by witnesses, completely cementing his guilt. Trent hesitated for only a fraction of a second. His ego was far too massive to recognize a trap. The idea of standing on a stage playing the triumphant, invincible business mogul in front of the entire city was too intoxicating for him to resist. He eagerly agreed. He promised the investor a spectacular show. He hung up the phone, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant. A few minutes later, Trent walked out of the home office. He was practically vibrating with victory. He walked into the living room, grabbed my wife Vivian by the waist, and kissed her. He spun her around, laughing like a maniac. "We did it," he whispered to her, his voice trembling with greed. "The funding is secured. We are signing the final papers this Saturday at the gala. We are going to be richer than God." Vivian smiled, a cold, calculated smirk that made my stomach churn. She poured him a glass of scotch from my personal cabinet to celebrate. but then her smile faltered just a bit, and she looked over at me. I was still sitting in my armchair staring blankly at the wall, keeping up my pathetic performance. "What about him?" Vivian asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We cannot have him here on Saturday. The gala is the most important night of your career, Trent. Maya and I need to be there by your side. We cannot leave him alone in the house, and we certainly cannot hire a sitter. What if he has one of his episodes? What if he wanders out into the street and the police get involved? It would be a public relations nightmare. We cannot risk any distractions this weekend." Trent took a slow sip of his scotch, staring at me with absolute disgust. "You are right," he said coldly. "The power of attorney goes into effect immediately. There is no reason to wait anymore. He is just dead weight now." Vivian nodded, walking over to the kitchen counter and pulling out a glossy brochure. I recognized the logo. It was Shady Grove. It is a notorious state-run nursing home on the outskirts of the city. It is not a place where the elderly go to live out their golden years in comfort. It is a heavily medicated lockdown facility where unwanted relatives are dumped and forgotten. It is underfunded, understaffed, and famous for keeping its patients heavily sedated so they do not cause any trouble. "I already made the arrangements," Vivian said, her voice entirely devoid of any human empathy. "I paid the administrator a premium to fast-track his admission under an emergency psychiatric hold. The private ambulance will be here at 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon to collect him. They will strap him to a gurney, take him straight to the secure dementia ward, and lock the doors. We will be dressed in our evening gowns drinking champagne at the Ritz while he gets his first dose of institutional tranquilizers. He will never set foot in this house again." Trent smiled, raising his glass of my scotch to toast my wife. "To the future," he said. "To the future," she replied, clinking her glass against his. I sat there perfectly still, listening to the woman I had loved for 45 years casually plan my permanent exile into a chemical prison. They were going to throw me away like a piece of broken furniture just hours before they planned to steal my legacy on a silver stage. They thought they had tied up every loose end. They thought Saturday afternoon would be the tragic, quiet end of my story. But as I sat in that leather chair, staring blankly at the wall, a deep, dangerous fire ignited in my chest. They wanted to send an ambulance for me on Saturday. They wanted to lock me away in the dark so I could not ruin their big night. I was going to let them put me in that ambulance. I was going to let them think they had won. Because sometimes to completely destroy your enemies, you have to let them believe they have buried you. They thought Saturday night was going to be a celebration of their brilliant deception. They had no idea I was planning to crash the party, and I was bringing the entire federal government with me. Saturday afternoon arrived with a heavy, suffocating tension hanging over my house, while the rest of my family was buzzing with excitement preparing for Trent's massive corporate gala. I was sitting in my worn armchair in the living room playing the role of a dead man walking. I was dressed in a faded, oversized sweater and a pair of old house slippers. I kept my chin tucked to my chest, letting my hands tremble slightly against my lap. From the grand staircase, I heard the clicking of Vivian's heels. She walked down into the living room, but she was not carrying my vintage leather weekend bag. She was not carrying the sturdy suitcase we had used for our anniversary trip to Paris 10 years ago. She was holding 2 cheap black plastic trash bags. I watched through half-closed eyes as the woman I had been married to for 45 years walked over to a pile of my clothes she had tossed on the sofa. She began grabbing my sweaters, my socks, and my comfortable trousers, casually stuffing them into the garbage bags. She was throwing my life away like yesterday's refuse. There was no care in her movements. There was no hesitation. After nearly half a century of building a life together, of sharing a bed, of holding her hand through sickness and health, she was packing my remaining days into black plastic. She tied a tight knot at the top of the first bag and stood in front of my chair. She looked down at me, and her face was a mask of absolute coldness. There was not a single tear in her eyes. There was no sorrow, no conflict, no lingering affection. "This place will be good for you, Clarence," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any human warmth. "You are getting dangerous at home. You left the stove on last week. You wander around the house in the middle of the night. It is just not safe for you here anymore. You will be much better off where medical professionals can watch you 24 hours a day." It was a brilliant lie delivered with the chilling ease of a seasoned sociopath. I had not touched the stove. I had not wandered the halls. She was reciting the exact narrative she and Trent had fabricated to justify locking me in a chemical prison. I wanted to look up and tell her I knew exactly what she was, I wanted to scream that I knew about the poison in my coffee, but I swallowed my pride, letting my head droop lower, staring blankly at the expensive hardwood floor. The heavy front door opened and Maya walked in. My daughter. The little girl I used to read bedtime stories to, the child whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the woman whose college tuition I had paid by working overtime at the IRS. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress, her hair pinned up elegantly for the gala tonight. Maya stopped in the hallway. She looked at the black trash bag sitting on the floor, and then she looked at me slumped in my chair. For a split second, just a fleeting fraction of a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt cross her face. I saw the daughter I raised fighting against the monster she had become. But the fight was over before it even began. Maya quickly turned her head away, avoiding my gaze completely. She pulled her expensive phone from her purse and started typing furiously, pretending she was too busy to notice her own father being discarded like a piece of broken furniture. That silence, that deliberate refusal to look me in the eye, hurt infinitely worse than the toxic poison her husband had been feeding me. It was the final nail in the coffin of my family. I was officially a man with no wife and no daughter. A loud, heavy knock echoed through the house. Trent strutted out of the home office to answer it. He was already wearing his custom-tailored tuxedo, looking like a vulture ready to feast on a fresh carcass. He opened the door and two burly men stepped into my living room. They wore dark blue medical scrubs and carried a thick clipboard. They looked tough and intimidating, exactly the kind of unsmiling muscle a notorious place like Shady Grove would send to collect a difficult dementia patient. Clarence Vance, the taller orderly, asked, his voice rough and devoid of any pleasantries. Trent stepped forward and handed the men the forged medical authorization he had bought from the dirty doctor. "He is docile right now, but he gets confused and aggressive." Trent lied smoothly, slipping his hands into his tuxedo pockets. "Just take him straight to the secure memory care ward. The administrator is expecting him." The two burly men flanked my armchair. One grabbed my left arm and the other gripped my right. They pulled me up roughly from my seat. I let my legs drag a little, keeping my knees bent, playing the pathetic, over-medicated old man to absolute perfection. As they led me toward the front door, I passed Vivian. She was standing in front of the large hallway mirror, carefully adjusting her diamond earrings. She did not even turn around to say goodbye. I passed Maya. She kept her eyes glued to her phone screen, her jaw locked tight, refusing to acknowledge my existence. I passed Trent. He was standing by the door, holding it open. As I shuffled past him, he gave me a mocking, triumphant little smirk. He thought he had just won the $30 million lottery. They led me down the front steps and out into the warm Georgia afternoon. A plain white medical transport van with tinted windows was parked in my driveway. The taller orderly opened the heavy back doors and practically shoved me inside. The other man tossed my two black trash bags onto the cold metal floor. The doors slammed shut, plunging the back of the van into dim shadows. I heard the engine roar to life. The van pulled out of my driveway, rolling down the street, taking me away from the only home I had known for decades. We drove in complete silence for about 2 miles. I listened to the sounds of the traffic outside, waiting patiently until I was absolutely certain we were far out of my neighborhood and merging onto the main highway. Then I stopped slouching. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling a satisfying pop in my stiff joints. I lifted my head high. I wiped the fake drool from the corner of my mouth and ran a hand over my face. I reached into my pocket and my hands were no longer shaking. They were as steady as a master surgeon holding a scalpel. I looked at the two burly orderlies sitting across from me in the back of the van. The taller one, the man who had grabbed my arm so roughly, pulled off his medical cap and let out a deep, rumbling chuckle. "You put on a hell of a show back there, Mr. Vance," he said, his rough voice dropping the act and shifting into a sharp, respectful, professional tone. For a second, when we walked into that living room, I actually thought we were kidnapping a sick old man. I smiled. A real, genuine, dangerous smile. These men did not work for the Shady Grove nursing home. They were undercover federal agents hand-picked and planted by my lawyer Marcus. This plain white transport van was not heading to a lockdown dementia ward. It was a highly secure mobile command unit operated jointly by the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my faded sweater and pulled out a small encrypted USB drive. This tiny piece of plastic contained everything. It held the high-resolution scanned copies of the forged power of attorney. It held the fake medical evaluation signed by Dr. Carter. It held the crystal-clear hidden camera video of Trent handing over the $50,000 cash bribe in my hallway. It contained the offshore banking routing numbers proving his massive $25 million Ponzi scheme. And it held the damning audio recordings of my wife and son-in-law coldly plotting my institutionalization. I handed the USB drive to the federal agent. It is all there. I said, my voice crisp, clear, and commanding. Every single piece of evidence you need to put Trenton Sterling and Vivian Vance in a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. The agent took the drive and immediately plugged it into a rugged laptop bolted to the steel wall of the van. He typed in a security clearance code and nodded firmly, signaling to me that the data was secured and transmitting to their headquarters. I looked down at the faded old sweater I was wearing and the cheap house slippers on my feet. I had played the victim for weeks. I had swallowed my pride, drank their poison, and let them treat me like garbage just to get to this exact moment. But the act was officially over. I knocked hard on the metal partition separating the back of the van from the front cabin. Agent, I called out to the man behind the steering wheel. Turn this van around and head toward the luxury district in Buckhead. We need to make a stop at my personal tailor. I refuse to destroy my son-in-law's entire empire wearing these miserable rags. Step on it, gentlemen. I have a very important party to attend tonight. The bespoke tailor shop in Buckhead was completely closed to the public by the time the federal agents escorted me through the back entrance. I stood in the private fitting room and dropped the oversized faded sweater and the cheap house slippers onto the hardwood floor. They landed in a pathetic little pile. That pile represented the sick, weak, and broken old man my family desperately wanted me to be. I stepped over it, and I never looked back. The master tailor, an old Italian man who had been making my suit since my early days at the Internal Revenue Service, was waiting for me. He did not ask any questions about the armed federal agent standing guard by the door. He simply brought out the garment bag. I slipped my arms into a crisp white shirt made of pure Egyptian cotton. I fastened my heavy platinum cufflinks. Then came the suit. It was a three-piece charcoal gray masterpiece cut from thick English wool, tailored perfectly to my exact measurements. I slid my feet into polished black leather Oxfords. When I looked in the three-way mirror, I did not see a 70-year-old dementia patient bound for a locked memory care ward. I saw a veteran federal fraud investigator. I saw a man who owned $30 million of prime Atlanta real estate. I saw an executioner. We left the tailor and walked out into the cool evening air. A massive black tactical surveillance van was parked discreetly in the alleyway. The heavy side door slid open and I stepped inside. The interior was a highly sophisticated mobile command center. The walls were lined with glowing monitors and complex audio equipment. 3 federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and headsets sat at the control panels. My attorney Marcus was sitting in the corner holding a thick leather briefcase resting on his lap. He looked at my tailored suit and gave me a slow, satisfied nod. He knew exactly what was about to happen. We drove through the busy streets of downtown Atlanta until we parked in a designated secure loading bay right beneath the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The engine cut off, leaving us in the quiet hum of the surveillance equipment. We were sitting directly under the grand ballroom where Vanguard Real Estate Solutions was hosting its 10-year anniversary gala. One of the federal agents tapped a keyboard, and the largest monitor on the wall flickered to life. We had a crystal-clear, high-definition live feed of the grand ballroom. My lawyer Marcus had managed to slip 2 undercover operatives into the catering staff, and their hidden lapel cameras gave us perfect, unobstructed views of the entire room. The ballroom was a sea of absolute luxury. Massive crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets carried silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and imported caviar. The room was packed with 500 of Atlanta's most influential people. There were city council members, wealthy socialites, and heavy-hitting corporate investors. It was exactly the kind of high-society circus my wife Vivian had always craved and felt she deserved. I spotted her instantly on the screen. Vivian was standing right near the center of the room. She was wearing a stunning floor-length evening gown, heavily studded with rhinestones that caught the chandelier light with every single movement. A thick diamond necklace rested against her collarbone. She was laughing brightly, tilting her head back, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. She looked radiant. She looked like the absolute queen of high society. Looking at her massive smile, you would never guess that just 3 hours ago she had packed her husband of 45 years into a black garbage bag and shipped him off to a chemical prison. She was celebrating my execution. Next to her stood my daughter Maya. She was wearing her emerald silk dress clinging tightly to her husband's arm. She looked a little nervous, but she was doing her absolute best to play the part of the devoted, supportive wife to a brilliant mogul. And then there was Trent. He was standing on the main stage at the front of the ballroom, bathed in a bright white spotlight. He adjusted his custom-tailored tuxedo and tapped the microphone. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd quieted down. The camera zoomed in on his face. He looked incredibly smug, perfectly arrogant, and entirely invincible. He flashed his signature brilliant smile at the audience. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Trent's voice echoed through the high-quality speakers in the surveillance van. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating 10 years of Vanguard real estate, we are celebrating the future of this beautiful city. I am incredibly proud to announce that as of this afternoon, Vanguard has officially acquired full legal control over the most coveted commercial property in downtown Atlanta, the historic Legacy Block." A polite round of applause rippled through the ballroom. On the monitor, I saw Vivian clapping enthusiastically, her rhinestone gown shimmering under the lights. Trent raised his hands to quiet the room, his massive ego practically radiating through the screen. This acquisition was not easy. Trent continued, his voice dripping with completely fake humility. "It took a lot of careful negotiation and a lot of family sacrifice. But this historic land will serve as the foundation for our newest and most ambitious luxury high-rise project to date. And to fund this monumental vision, I am honored to welcome our new international partners who have flown in from Europe just to be here with us tonight to finalize the deal." I watched as the European investment manager, the man who was secretly cooperating with my attorney, stepped onto the stage. He carried a sleek leather portfolio containing the loan documents. The crowd clapped again. Trent was literally bragging about stealing my life's work while standing in front of the very people he was actively trying to defraud. He was spinning a fairy tale built entirely on forged signatures, poisoned coffee, and $25 million of toxic hidden debt. He thought he was sealing his legacy forever. He truly believed the old man was heavily sedated miles away, strapped to a hospital bed with no memory of his own name. I leaned closer to the monitor. The anger and the heartbreak I had felt over the past few weeks were completely gone. In their place was a cold, absolute focus. I watched Trent shake hands with the European investor. I watched Vivian smile at the crowd, taking a long, triumphant sip of her champagne. They were at the absolute peak of their imaginary mountain. They were standing on the very summit of their deception. It was the perfect altitude for a fatal drop. The lead FBI agent sitting at the main console turned away from the glowing screens. He pressed a finger to his earpiece, listening to a secure encrypted transmission from the tactical teams positioned at the ballroom doors upstairs. He took off his headset and looked directly at me. His expression was dead serious, entirely professional, and utterly ruthless. "The perimeter is completely locked down," he said, his voice steady and calm in the quiet van. "The undercover agents have secured all the exits. The financial fraud task force is in position in the main lobby. The target has publicly confessed to the fraudulent acquisition on a live microphone, and the forged documents are currently in his hands." The agent reached over and slid the heavy metal door of the van open. The cool, damp air of the underground loading dock rushed in. He looked at me and gave a sharp, respectful nod. "The arrest warrants are fully authorized and ready, Mr. Vance," the agent said softly. "The stage is yours." I stood up from my seat inside the van. I adjusted the crisp cuffs of my tailored Egyptian cotton shirt and buttoned my charcoal gray suit jacket. I picked up my solid oak walking cane not because I needed it for balance, but because it completed the picture of the man they thought they had successfully destroyed. I stepped out of the van and onto the cold concrete floor of the loading dock. I did not feel like a betrayed husband or a forgotten father anymore. I felt like a violent thunderstorm about to break over a completely unsuspecting city. I walked toward the service elevator that led directly up to the grand ballroom, ready to bring their entire fake world crashing down to the ground. The service elevator ascended slowly, whining and grinding its gears as it carried me up from the cold loading dock. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting atop the polished handle of my solid oak cane. I was not leaning on it for physical support. I was holding it like a judge holds a gavel. The digital numbers above the metal doors lit up one by one, counting down the final remaining seconds of Trenton Sterling's imaginary empire. Beside me stood two federal agents in perfectly tailored suits. Their earpieces were completely silent and their eyes were sharply focused. We were not rushing. True power never rushes. It arrives exactly when it intends to. The elevator doors slid open to a long carpeted hallway situated just behind the main ballroom entrance. The heavy, ornate mahogany double doors stood securely closed in front of me, guarded by two private event security staff. They saw the golden federal badges flash briefly in the dim light, and they stepped aside without saying a single word. Through the thick carved wood, I could easily hear Trent's voice echoing over the premium hotel sound system. It was that same slick, overconfident tone he always used when he tried to sell me terrible investment deals over Sunday dinner. He was enthusiastically wrapping up his grand speech. He was standing boldly on the precipice of his massive lie, confidently pulling 500 of Atlanta's most powerful and influential people into his criminal delusion. I stood in the shadows and listened as he thanked the city mayor. I listened as he thanked his private equity partners for their unwavering trust, and then he played his final desperate card. I heard the crisp rustle of thick paper over the microphone. He was holding up the forged power of attorney for everyone to see. He proudly announced to the massive room that through the careful, loving transition of family assets, Vanguard Real Estate now held complete and total legal authority over the historic legacy block. He told the wealthy crowd that this document represented the beautiful passing of the torch from the old generation directly to the new. He actually had the absolute nerve to ask for a round of applause for his father-in-law, claiming I was resting comfortably at a highly specialized care facility, completely unable to attend, but blessing this glorious corporate union in spirit. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it made the blood in my veins run ice cold. The entire crowd erupted into thunderous applause. They were blindly clapping for a man who had paid to put poison in my morning coffee. They were cheering for a man who had secretly traded his own wife's financial security for a few more months of pretending to be a rich mogul. They were celebrating a mirage built on blood and betrayal. I looked at the lead federal agent standing to my right. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the heavy brass handles of the mahogany doors. With one swift, incredibly forceful motion, he pushed them wide open. The heavy doors slammed violently against the interior walls with a booming crack that echoed sharply over the applause. It was a sound exactly like a gunshot. The rhythmic clapping at the back of the room stopped instantly. Hundreds of heads turned in confusion. The elegant string quartet that had been playing softly in the corner faltered, hitting a terrible sour note before falling completely and utterly silent. The wave of dead silence rolled quickly from the back of the massive ballroom all the way to the front, sweeping over the crowd of 500 elites like a sudden winter freeze. I stepped slowly over the threshold and walked directly into the golden light of the massive crystal chandeliers. I was not wearing faded gray sweatpants. I was not shuffling my feet in cheap, worn-out house slippers. I was wearing a charcoal gray English wool suit perfectly tailored to my broad shoulders. My posture was military straight. My expression was carved from absolute stone. I gripped the solid oak cane firmly and took my first deliberate step onto the pristine white marble aisle that divided the massive room. Thump! The heavy wooden base of my cane struck the polished marble floor. It was the only sound in a room filled with 500 wealthy people who had suddenly stopped breathing. Thump! I took another measured step forward. The sea of wealthy socialites, influential politicians, and arrogant real estate moguls began to part. They moved out of my way instinctively, quickly stepping back and pulling their expensive silk gowns and tailored tuxedos completely clear of my path. They did not know exactly what was happening, but human beings have a deep primal instinct for approaching danger. They recognized a predator walking into the room. Thump! I kept my eyes locked dead ahead. I did not look at the local mayor. I did not look at the nervous city councilman I had personally audited 2 decades ago. My cold gaze was fixed entirely on the brightly lit stage at the front of the room. Trent was standing frozen behind the clear crystal podium. His right hand was still holding the forged medical power of attorney high in the air, but his triumphant smile was completely gone. The smug, arrogant expression had violently melted off his face, quickly replaced by a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a fresh grave. His mouth hung slightly open, but no words came out. The highly sensitive microphone picked up the ragged, shallow sound of his terrified breathing. His hand began to shake uncontrollably, and the fraudulent paper fluttered visibly under the bright stage lights. To the left of the stage, standing near the exclusive VIP tables, was my wife. Vivian had been beaming just moments before, fully basking in the warm glow of her stolen social status. When she saw me walking down the center aisle, her entire body went completely rigid. The color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her looking as pale as a corpse. Her fingers went totally limp. The crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne slipped right out of her hand. It hit the hard marble floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp, violent sound of breaking glass echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, but she did not even flinch. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrified realization that the chemical prison she had enthusiastically paid for was completely empty. Right next to her, my daughter Maya stumbled backward in shock. She actually bumped hard into a tall cocktail table, knocking over a heavy floral centerpiece. She pressed her trembling hands tightly over her mouth, her panicked eyes darting frantically from me to her mother and then up to her husband, standing paralyzed on the stage. The grand, glamorous illusion she had been fiercely defending was collapsing right in front of her eyes. She thought I was a broken, heavily medicated old man who needed to be locked away for his own good. She was now looking at the veteran federal fraud investigator who had just systematically dismantled her entire life. Thump. I reached the very front of the room. I stood at the edge of the elevated stage, looking up at the cowardly man who had actively tried to erase my existence. The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound, so incredibly thick with tension, that you could clearly hear the low hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. 500 people were watching, holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Trent swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down nervously. He desperately tried to speak. He leaned forward toward the microphone, his voice barely a terrified, cracking whisper. He barely managed to stammer out my name. Clarence. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to project absolute authority. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes, letting the full, crushing weight of my presence destroy what little confidence he had left. I am so sorry I am late, I said. My voice was deep, warm, and sharp as a razor blade. It carried perfectly through the silent room, reaching every single person present. I adjusted my platinum cufflinks slowly, my hands perfectly steady. The traffic coming from the nursing home was a bit of a nightmare. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was broken by the sound of Trent clearing his throat. The sheer panic in his eyes was painfully obvious to me, but he was a desperate man backed into a corner, and desperate men will always try to spin one last lie. He gripped the edges of the clear crystal podium so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He forced a wide, tight smile onto his face, looking out at the sea of wealthy investors and politicians. He let out a soft, patronizing chuckle, trying to project the image of a deeply burdened, loving son-in-law. "Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive this unfortunate interruption," Trent said into the microphone, his voice shaking just enough to ruin his confident facade. As I mentioned to some of you earlier this evening, my father-in-law is tragically suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia. His condition has deteriorated severely in the past few days. He is currently having a severe medical episode. He is deeply confused and he does not know where he is. Please, I apologize for this disturbance. Trent looked to the side of the massive room and gave a frantic, urgent nod to the private event security team. 4 large, broad-shouldered men wearing earpieces and dark suits immediately stepped away from the walls and began moving quickly down the center aisle toward me. They looked like bouncers ready to forcefully remove a drunk patron from a nightclub. The wealthy elite in the audience began to murmur among themselves, shaking their heads with sympathetic sighs. They looked at me with pity. They truly believed they were witnessing the tragic, embarrassing breakdown of a senile old man who had escaped from his caretakers. But their pity did not even have time to settle. Before the 4 private security guards could even come within 10 feet of me, the 2 men in tailored suits who had escorted me from the loading dock stepped smoothly out of the shadows. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision that no private hotel security could ever match. The lead federal agent stepped directly in front of the largest hotel guard and raised his left hand. In his right hand, he flipped open a leather wallet, exposing a gleaming, golden federal badge that caught the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. "Federal agents," the man said, his voice incredibly calm but carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of the United States government. "Stand down immediately and back away. Do not interfere with this operation." The 4 private security guards froze instantly. The color drained from their faces as they looked at the federal badges. They slowly raised their hands in the air, taking several large steps backward, completely abandoning their post. A collective, synchronized gasp echoed through the massive ballroom. The 500 members of the Atlanta elite suddenly realized this was not a tragic family disturbance. This was a coordinated high-level federal takedown, and they were sitting right in the middle of the blast zone. I did not stop walking. I took the short set of velvet-carpeted stairs leading up to the main stage, my solid oak cane tapping rhythmically with every single step. I walked directly up to the crystal podium. Trent shrank back, his body trembling so violently that he nearly knocked over a tall arrangement of white orchids. He looked like a small, terrified child. The towering, arrogant real estate mogul had completely vanished, leaving behind nothing but a cowardly fraud staring into the eyes of his executioner. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the microphone, pulling it smoothly from the heavy stand. I looked Trent dead in his panicked, tear-filled eyes. "I have not lost my mind, Trent," I said, my deep voice booming through the state-of-the-art concert speakers filling every single corner of the cavernous ballroom. "But you are about to lose your freedom." I did not wait for him to respond. I turned my head and gave a sharp, subtle nod to the audio-visual booth located at the very back of the room. My attorney Marcus had already secured the control room with another undercover federal agent 10 minutes before I walked through the doors. The massive high-definition LED screens towering behind the stage, which had been proudly displaying the Vanguard Real Estate logo in bright gold letters, suddenly went completely black. The room went dark for one terrifying second. Then the screens flickered to life. It was not a corporate presentation. It was the hidden camera footage from my own living room. The video quality was crystal clear, magnified 50 times its original size for the entire elite society of Atlanta to see. There, towering over the stage, was the image of Trent sitting on my leather sofa, leaning closely toward my wife, Vivian. The audio technician in the back turned the volume up to maximum capacity. Trent's own voice, captured perfectly by the hidden microphone, thundered through the ballroom. 3 drops in his coffee every morning. It mimics Alzheimer's perfectly. We need him incapacitated by the end of the month. Once the doctor signs off on his mental decline, we can activate the power of attorney. We need that land, Vivian. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated horror. Wealthy socialites screamed out loud, covering their mouths with trembling hands. Men in expensive tuxedos shouted in absolute disgust. Several people actually dropped their champagne glasses, letting them shatter on the marble floor. On the screen, my wife nodded slowly, taking the dark glass vial of poison and slipping it into her pocket. "I do not want any legal issues." Her giant, magnified face projected her chilling complicity to the entire city. I looked out into the crowd. Vivian was standing exactly where I had seen her earlier, but she was no longer the radiant queen of the ball. She was completely broken. People were physically backing away from her, staring at her with looks of absolute revulsion and terror, as if she were a literal monster. She sank to her knees right there in her expensive rhinestone gown, burying her face in her hands, weeping hysterically as the reality of her public destruction crushed her. Maya was standing a few feet away, sobbing uncontrollably, shaking her head as the elite crowd she so desperately wanted to belong to looked at her family with pure disgust. But I was not finished. I had not just come to expose a poisoning. I had come to dismantle an entire criminal conspiracy. I gave another nod to the back of the room. The massive screens behind me blinked again. The living room footage vanished instantly, replaced by the extremely tight, high-definition angle of my hidden button camera. The crowd fell dead silent again, absolutely captivated by the unfolding nightmare. The screens showed the grand foyer of my house. It showed Dr. Arthur Carter, the expensive, highly respected concierge physician who catered to half the people sitting in this very ballroom. It showed Trent reaching into his tailored jacket. It showed him pulling out a thick, bulging white envelope of cash and pressing it directly into the doctor's hands. The audio was perfectly crisp. "Here is the second half of the 50,000 we agreed on," Trent's voice echoed across the massive room. "Just sign the damn paper and make it look convincing." The crowd watched in breathless horror as Dr. Carter laughed greedily, stuffing the bribe into his briefcase. The European investment manager, the man who was standing on the stage holding the fraudulent $20 million loan documents, turned absolutely pale. He looked at Trent with a mixture of intense fury and utter disbelief. He threw the sleek leather portfolio directly onto the floor of the stage, the forged papers scattering across the polished wood. He backed away from Trent, as if the man were carrying a deadly plague. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. It was a symphony of shouting, screaming, and furious disbelief. Investors were pulling out their cell phones, frantically dialing their brokers and attorneys, screaming orders to freeze all funds and sever all ties with Vanguard Real Estate. Politicians were rushing toward the exit doors, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the greatest public scandal in Atlanta's history. Trent collapsed. His knees gave out and he fell hard onto the stage floor, landing right next to my polished leather shoes. He curled into a pathetic, trembling ball, pulling his hands over his head as the deafening screams of the angry crowd washed over him. His entire life, his fake wealth, his fraudulent company, and his massive ego had been completely vaporized in less than 3 minutes. I stood above him, leaning on my solid oak cane, watching the total destruction of his world. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. He had dug this massive grave with his own hands, and I had simply provided the spotlight for him to fall into it. Trent pushed himself up from the hard wooden floor of the stage. His custom-tailored tuxedo was wrinkled and covered in the dust of his own ruined grandstand. He scrambled backward like a cornered rat, frantically searching for a way out of a trap that had already snapped shut. He lunged for the clear crystal podium where his fraudulent papers were scattered. He grabbed the thick stack of forged documents and held them up tightly against his chest, as if those flimsy pieces of paper could somehow deflect the bullets I had just fired into his life. "That is fake," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "It is all fake. Do not listen to him. He is a sick old man. He is out of his mind. I have the legal power of attorney right here in my hands. He signed it. The doctor signed it. The legacy block is mine. It legally belongs to Vanguard Real Estate." He was pointing wildly at the massive blank screens behind us, as if he could magically erase the hidden camera footage the entire city had just witnessed. He looked out at the massive crowd of wealthy investors and politicians, begging them with his wide, terrified eyes to believe his pathetic lie. He was sweating profusely. Thick drops of perspiration rolled down his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. But nobody in that grand ballroom was buying his performance. The crowd was staring at him like he was a dead animal rotting in the hot summer sun. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there, leaning heavily on my solid oak cane, watching him drown in the shallow puddle of his own massive delusion. Before Trent could scream another desperate lie into the microphone, a new voice echoed across the stage. It was deep resonant and carried the absolute, undeniable authority of the law. "You do not own a single square inch of anything, Trenton." My attorney Marcus walked slowly out from the dark shadows of the backstage wings. He did not look like a man who had come to argue or debate. He looked like a man who had come to deliver a final devastating verdict. He was wearing a sharp-tailored midnight blue suit and carrying a heavy vintage leather briefcase in his right hand. He walked right past the European investor who was still standing near the edge of the stage, staring at Trent in absolute disgust. Marcus stopped right next to me. He placed his heavy leather briefcase directly onto the crystal podium, pushing Trent's trembling hands out of the way. He popped the brass locks. They clicked open, sounding incredibly loud and sharp in the tense, heavy silence of the ballroom. He pulled out a thick, bound stack of official legal documents bearing the heavy, embossed seal of the state of Georgia. Marcus looked out at the 500 wealthy elite in the audience, making sure he had their complete, undivided attention, and then he turned his cold, dark eyes directly onto my son-in-law. "You are holding a piece of paper that you forged," Marcus said, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system with terrifying clarity. "But even if that medical power of attorney were totally real, it would still be completely and utterly worthless." Trent stared at him, his jaw trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. "What are you talking about?" Trent stammered, clutching his forged papers tighter against his chest. "It gives me total control of his assets. The land is mine." I filed the paperwork. Marcus let out a short, cold, humorless laugh. He picked up the heavy state-stamped document from his briefcase and held it up high for the entire room to see. "The legacy block does not belong to Clarence Vance," Marcus announced to the entire silent room. "It has not belonged to him for exactly 3 weeks. 21 days ago, my client legally and permanently transferred the entire $30 million commercial property into the Vance family irrevocable trust. He surrendered all direct personal ownership. I am the sole managing trustee. You cannot use a medical power of attorney to seize an asset that the patient does not even own. You forged a federal document to steal a ghost, Trenton. You own absolutely nothing." Trent literally stopped breathing. I watched the devastating realization physically hit his body. The color drained from his neck all the way down to his collar. My coffee was a little bitter. I 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 was a little bitter. My coffee, paying off dirty doctors and manipulating my daughter, all to steal an empty vault. But Marcus was not finished. The veteran lawyer leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping to a low, deadly register that sent shivers through the crowd. But your sheer, monumental stupidity is not your biggest problem tonight, Marcus continued, unrelenting. The problem is what you did with those forged papers before you got here. My client is a retired investigator for the Internal Revenue Service, Trenton. We do not just watch you steal, we watch where you put the money. We have your digital transfer logs. We know that yesterday afternoon you submitted that fraudulent power of attorney and a fake property deed to a federally insured commercial bank. You needed capital to keep your shadow lenders at bay, so you used an asset you do not own, backed by a medical signature you forged to secure a $20 million bridge loan. The words hung in the air, heavy, absolute, and completely lethal. Marcus turned away from Trent and looked out at the crowd, making sure every single investor, hedge fund manager, and local politician heard the final nail being driven into the coffin. That is not just a standard breach of corporate contract, Marcus declared loudly. That is first-degree federal bank fraud. That is wire fraud. That is grand larceny and conspiracy to commit medical fraud. You did not just bankrupt your company, Trenton. You just bought yourself 25 years in a federal penitentiary. The reaction in the grand ballroom was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The absolute reality of Trent's massive federal crimes washed over the crowd of 500 elites like a sudden violent tidal wave of panic. These were highly calculating people who survived on immaculate reputations and clean, regulated money. Being in the exact same room as a man who had just committed massive federal bank fraud was a toxic radioactive infection they simply could not afford. The wealthy socialites and arrogant real estate moguls did not just stand there and gasp in shock. They went into full aggressive corporate survival mode. Every single person in the exclusive VIP section pulled out their cell phone at the exact same time. The massive ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of frantic dialed numbers, angry shouting, and desperate financial orders. I looked down into the sea of expensive suits and silk dresses and watched the total annihilation of Vanguard real estate happen in real time. I heard wealthy hedge fund managers screaming at their personal brokers, demanding that they dump every single share they had tied to Trent's development projects before the market opened on Monday. I saw the local city politicians frantically waving to their panic-stricken aides, ordering them to immediately scrub their names from any zoning permits or public endorsements associated with Vanguard. The European investment manager, the man who was supposed to provide the final cash injection to save Trent's entire Ponzi scheme, picked up his sleek leather portfolio from the stage floor. He looked at Trent with a glare of pure, unadulterated financial hatred, spat directly onto the polished wood of the stage, and walked briskly out the back double doors without ever looking back. In less than 60 seconds, millions upon millions of dollars of private funding, institutional investments, and corporate backing vanished completely into thin air. Trent's entire grand empire, his proposed glass high-rises, his leased luxury cars, his arrogant country club memberships evaporated right in front of his eyes. The massive company he had built on lies, manipulation, and stolen money was now officially valued at absolutely zero. He was completely and hopelessly broke. But he was much worse than broke. He was a radioactive liability drowning in $25 million of toxic debt, owing money to aggressive shadow lenders and facing decades behind federal bars. Trent looked out at the frantic, screaming crowd, his eyes wide with a hollow, absolute despair. His fingers went limp. He dropped the forged power of attorney. The fake papers fluttered down lazily, landing completely useless at the tips of my polished leather shoes. He fell back heavily against the velvet stage curtain, covering his pale face with his trembling hands and letting out a pathetic, high-pitched sob. He was a totally ruined man. His financial and social destruction was total, absolute, and irreversible. I stood silently beside my attorney, leaning on my oak cane, watching the wealthy elite of Atlanta tear my son-in-law's life to absolute shreds. I did not lift a single finger to help him. I had tried to protect my family, but they chose to serve me poison. Now they had to sit in the dark and drink it to the very last drop. The chaos in the grand ballroom shifted from frantic financial panic to a heavy, terrified silence as the full weight of the federal government stepped out of the shadows. The wealthy elite of Atlanta, who had been screaming into their cell phones just seconds earlier, suddenly went completely mute. They backed away from the main stage, pressing themselves tightly against the silk-covered walls of the Ritz-Carlton. They recognized the inevitable end of the line. Two senior agents stepped forward from the back of the room. They were not wearing the standard dark suits of private security. They were wearing heavy tactical vests with IRS criminal investigation emblazoned across the back in stark bright yellow letters. They were flanked by 3 armed FBI agents whose faces were carved from absolute stone. They did not walk with the hurried panic of the socialites around them. They moved with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a completely sealed conviction. The lead agent walked up the velvet stairs of the stage. He did not even look at the screaming crowd. His eyes were locked entirely on Trent, who was still curled up in a pathetic, trembling ball near the heavy velvet curtain. Trent looked up, his face pale and slick with a terrified sweat. His expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo was covered in dust, and his carefully styled hair was plastered wildly against his forehead. He looked like a small, frightened animal trapped in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. The lead agent stopped right in front of him. He reached down to his tactical belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, carrying over the state-of-the-art sound system. Trenton Sterling, the agent, declared, his voice booming with absolute, undeniable authority. "You are under arrest for first-degree securities fraud, massive federal tax evasion, and the premeditated conspiracy to commit murder." Trent let out a loud, guttural sob. He tried to scramble backward, pressing his back against the curtain as if he could somehow push his way through the solid wall behind it. He shook his head wildly, tears streaming down his face, begging for his lawyer, begging for someone to explain that this was all a terrible mistake. But the agents did not hesitate. 2 massive officers grabbed him roughly by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo and hoisted him violently to his feet. They slammed him chest first against the clear crystal podium. The podium rattled dangerously as they forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The heavy steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a loud, deafening click. Trent collapsed into a fit of pathetic, high-pitched weeping, completely stripped of his arrogant mogul facade. He was nothing but a broken thief facing decades in a federal cage. But the federal agents were not finished. The lead agent turned away from the sobbing mess on the stage and looked directly down into the VIP section of the ballroom. He locked eyes with my wife. Vivian was standing frozen amidst the shattered pieces of her crystal champagne flute. The women she had spent years trying to impress, the wealthy wives of politicians and hedge fund managers, were now physically recoiling from her. They pulled their expensive silk gowns tightly against their bodies, desperate to avoid brushing against a woman who was about to be handcuffed. Vivian looked around wildly, her eyes wide and frantic, searching the crowd for a single sympathetic face. She found absolutely nothing but cold, disgusted judgment. The lead agent stepped down from the stage and marched directly toward her. His heavy boots crunched loudly over the broken glass on the marble floor. He stopped mere inches from her face, completely ignoring the expensive perfume she wore and the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. Vivian Vance. The agent said, his voice slicing through the thick air of the ballroom. You are under arrest for accessory to attempted murder wire fraud and the federal forgery of medical documents. The reality of the words finally penetrated her mind. The grand, glamorous illusion she had built for herself shattered completely. She was not going to walk out of this hotel as the matriarch of a real estate empire. She was going to be escorted out the service elevator in handcuffs and loaded into the back of a federal transport van. The agent reached out to grab her wrist, and in that exact moment, her mind completely snapped. Vivian broke away from his grasp, stumbling awkwardly in her high heels. She lunged frantically toward the stage, throwing herself forward with a desperate, hysterical scream. She dropped heavily to her knees right at the very edge of the elevated platform, right at the tips of my polished leather shoes. The hard impact bruised her knees, but she did not even seem to feel it. She reached out with violently trembling hands and grabbed tight fistfuls of my charcoal gray trousers. She began to weep uncontrollably. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical wail that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. The thick layer of expensive designer makeup she had applied so carefully hours earlier began to run down her face in dark, muddy streaks. "Clarence," she wailed, her voice cracking with pure absolute terror. "Clarence, please. You have to stop them. Please tell them to stop. I am your wife. We have been married for 45 years. You cannot let them do this to me." She looked up at me, her face a twisted mask of desperation and fear. She tugged on my trousers, her diamond rings catching the bright stage lights. She thought she could still manipulate me. She thought she could reach deep down and pull on the heartstrings of the man who had loved her for nearly half a century. "Please, Clarence," she sobbed violently, tears and mascara dripping onto the pristine white marble floor. "I swear I did not want to do it. Trent forced me. I only did it for our daughter. I only went along with the plan to make sure Maya was safe and taken care of. I did it for our family, Clarence. Please forgive me." I looked down at the woman kneeling in the dirt at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a single trace of the love I had carried for her for 45 years. My heart was completely and utterly hollowed out, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a man who had survived a lethal betrayal. I looked at the hands clutching my trousers, the same hands that had carefully counted out drops of a chemical lobotomy into my morning coffee while humming a cheerful gospel song. She had calculated the exact value of my life and decided it was worth a luxury condo and a few social club invitations. I did not try to pull my legs away from her desperate grip. I stood perfectly still, leaning the weight of my body onto my solid oak cane. I looked her dead in the eyes, letting the absolute freezing coldness of my stare pierce right through her pathetic excuses. My voice was incredibly steady, low, and completely devoid of any mercy. It carried perfectly through the silent ballroom, slicing through her hysterical sobs like a sharp butcher's knife. "You did not poison your husband for our daughter," I said, my words striking her like physical blows. "You poisoned me for that rhinestone evening gown you are wearing right now. You traded 45 years of my life for vintage champagne and the shallow approval of people who are currently laughing at your destruction." Vivian's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as the full weight of my unforgiving judgment crushed her. "Now let go of my suit," I commanded, my voice echoing with final, absolute authority. "Stand up and try to keep whatever last shred of dignity you have left." Her hands slowly went limp, her fingers uncurled, slipping away from the fabric of my trousers. She slumped forward, defeated, completely and totally destroyed. Two federal agents stepped up behind her, grabbing her firmly by the arms and pulling her roughly to her feet. They pulled her arms behind her back, and the sharp click of the second pair of handcuffs echoed through the room. They marched her away, her head hanging low, her expensive rhinestone gown dragging heavily across the floor. I stood on the stage and watched them lead my wife and my son-in-law out the back doors, leaving nothing but the shattered ruins of their greed behind them. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind the federal agents. The loud click of the brass latch echoed through the silent ballroom. Trent and Vivian were gone. They were currently being marched through the service corridors down to the loading dock, where the tactical vans waited to transport them to a federal holding facility. I stood on the elevated stage leaning on my solid oak cane and watched the flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside reflecting violently against the tall glass windows. The 500 members of the Atlanta elite were completely paralyzed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating smell of ruined reputations and shattered egos. They were all staring at the empty space where the golden couple of real estate had been standing just moments before. And then there was Maya. My daughter was left standing completely alone in the center of the VIP section. The wealthy socialites she had spent 5 years desperately trying to impress were actively backing away from her. They gathered their expensive silk wraps and pulled their husbands toward the exits, refusing to even look in her direction. She was a ghost in her own kingdom. She looked around wildly, her eyes wide and frantic as she watched her entire social circle abandon her in real time. Then she looked up at the stage. She looked at me. Maya picked up the skirt of her expensive emerald green silk dress and ran toward the velvet stairs. She stumbled on her high heels, almost falling, but she caught herself and scrambled up onto the platform. She threw herself at me, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck and burying her face into the lapel of my charcoal gray suit. She burst into loud, dramatic sobs. Her tears soaked through my Egyptian cotton shirt. "Daddy, please," she cried, her voice cracking with absolute terror and desperation. "Daddy, I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know they were poisoning you. I never would have let them do that to you. I did not know about the drops in your coffee. You have to believe me, Daddy. You are my father and I love you. Please tell me you believe me." For a brief moment, I closed my eyes. I felt the physical weight of my only child clinging to me, desperately begging for the safety and protection I had provided for her entire life. A weaker man would have melted. A weaker man would have wrapped his arms around his crying daughter, stroked her hair, and promised her that everything was going to be all right. But I was not a weak man. And I knew exactly who the woman crying on my shoulder really was. I did not hug her back. I kept my arms firmly at my sides. I stood perfectly still like a statue carved from dark stone until her hysterical sobbing began to slow down into confused, jagged breaths. I reached up with both of my hands. I firmly grabbed her wrists and physically untangled her arms from around my neck. I stepped back, creating a cold, physical distance between us. I looked her dead in the eyes. Her face was a messy canvas of smeared, expensive makeup and pure panic. "I believe you, Maya," I said, my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "I believe that you did not know about the haloperidol. I believe Trent and your mother kept the actual physical poisoning a secret from you so you could maintain your plausible deniability." Maya let out a massive sigh of relief. She reached out, trying to grab my hand again. "Thank God," she whispered, a hopeful smile breaking through her tears. "I knew you would understand. We can fix this, Daddy. We can start over, just you and me. We do not need them." I pulled my hand away before her fingers could even brush against my skin. The hopeful smile on her face froze and then slowly shattered as she looked at my cold, unforgiving expression. "You did not know about the poison." I continued, my words striking her like a physical blow. "But you knew everything else. You knew Trent was drowning in $25 million of toxic debt. You knew his company was a massive fraudulent shell game. You knew your mother forged my signature on those medical documents because you sat at the dining room table and watched her practice my handwriting for hours." Maya stumbled backward, shaking her head wildly, her emerald dress rustling against the stage floor. "No, Daddy, that is not true. I was scared of him. Trent manipulated me too. Do not insult my intelligence." "Maya," I snapped, my voice rising just a fraction, echoing sharply across the empty space between us. "I sat across from you at that bistro in Buckhead. I gave you the perfect opportunity to walk away. I offered to put the legacy block in a trust just for you to protect you from his financial collapse. And what did you do? You looked at your phone and texted your husband to warn him that the crazy old man was locking him out of the gold mine. You looked me in the eye and told me I was losing my mind. You told me I was standing in the way of your grand future." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was an absolute anchor dragging her down to the bottom of the ocean. "You stood in the hallway of my house this very afternoon," I said, stepping closer to her, forcing her to look at the absolute disgust in my eyes. "You stood there in your beautiful, expensive silk gown while two strange men dragged your father out of his own home to lock him in a chemical prison. You saw my life being stuffed into cheap black garbage bags. and you turned your head away. You stared at your cell phone because securing your status as a wealthy socialite wife was infinitely more important to you than the life of the man who raised you. I am sorry, she wept, dropping to her knees on the stage, covering her face with her hands. I was just so afraid of losing everything. I was so afraid of being poor. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy white paper that had been folded neatly in thirds. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing out the creases. I held it out, dropping it gently onto the polished floor right in front of her trembling knees. You should have been afraid of the man you married, I said softly. Because while you were busy helping him destroy me, he was busy gambling away your entire life. Read the paper, Maya. She slowly lowered her hands. Her mascara was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in thick, dark streams. She reached out with shaking fingers and picked up the document. She read the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. It was an official notice from the largest commercial bank in the state of Georgia. That is a formal notice of foreclosure, I explained, watching her eyes widen in absolute horror as her brain processed the legal text. Your brilliant husband did not pay cash for that sprawling suburban mansion you love so much. Over the last 8 months, he took out 3 separate massive mortgages against your home to desperately feed his failing Ponzi scheme. He is currently 90 days behind on the payments. The bank officially seized the property yesterday morning. The eviction notice will be nailed to your front door by tomorrow afternoon. Maya gasped a horrific, breathless sound. She dropped the paper as if it had physically burned her. She looked up at me, her eyes completely hollow, completely empty of all the arrogant pride she had carried for the last 5 years. He took everything from you, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute whisper. Your money, your house, your social status, and your family. He traded your entire life to buy himself a few more weeks of pretending to be rich, and you handed him the pen to do it. Daddy, please, she begged, crawling slightly forward on the stage, her expensive dress dragging across the floor. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? You cannot just leave me like this. I have nothing. I looked down at the daughter I had loved and protected for 35 years. The final cord tying me to the illusion of my family snapped completely, severing me from the past forever. I gripped the handle of my solid oak cane, adjusting my posture and turning my body away from her. You are officially left with nothing, Maya, I said, delivering the absolute final blow without a single ounce of hesitation. Welcome to the real world. I did not wait for her to answer. I did not look back at the broken, weeping woman on the floor. I walked slowly down the velvet stairs of the stage, my cane thumping rhythmically against the marble. I walked directly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, leaving her completely alone in the bright, glaring spotlight of her own absolute destruction. It has been exactly 6 months since the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton became the graveyard for my family. I am sitting at a small wrought iron table outside a quiet sidewalk cafe in downtown Atlanta. The morning air is crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. The sun is shining brightly over the city skyline, casting long, warm shadows across the pavement. I am wearing a comfortable tweed jacket and a simple newsboy cap. I do not need to wear the sharp tailored suits anymore. I do not have to project an aura of absolute federal authority to protect myself. I am simply an old man enjoying his morning, completely invisible to the busy people rushing past my table. Across the street from the cafe sits the Legacy Block. It is the exact $30 million parcel of commercial real estate that my wife and my son-in-law tried to chemically lobotomize me to steal. But instead of seeing Trent's soulless glass luxury condos rising into the sky, I see a completely different vision coming to life. The entire block has been transformed into a massive, bustling construction site. There are teams of workers in bright yellow vests operating heavy machinery, laying down solid foundations of steel and concrete. Massive banners are draped across the tall chain-link fencing that surrounds the perimeter. The signs are printed in bold, proud letters. They read, "The Vance Community Empowerment Center." It is not going to be a playground for the wealthy elite. It is going to be a massive state-of-the-art facility dedicated entirely to providing free legal aid, financial literacy programs, and startup capital for young Black entrepreneurs in Atlanta. It will be a place where kids from the very same tough neighborhoods I grew up in can come to learn how to build real, lasting generational wealth. It is entirely funded and protected by the Vance Family Irrevocable Trust. Marcus, My brilliant attorney and oldest friend is managing the entire construction project. I am just sitting here watching my true legacy grow. It is a monument to empowerment built directly over the ashes of their greed. I reach down and pick up the morning newspaper resting on my cafe table. I already knew the verdicts, but seeing them printed in stark black ink on the front page brings a profound, absolute sense of finality. The federal trials were incredibly short. When the United States government possesses high-definition video of you handing a thick envelope of cash to a corrupt doctor and crystal-clear audio of you plotting to poison your husband, your expensive defense attorneys do not have much material to work with. Trenton Sterling, the arrogant real estate visionary who thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room, was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The financial task force completely eviscerated his Ponzi scheme. His shadow lenders picked his remaining personal assets clean before the ink on his conviction was even dry. The newspaper detailed how he cried in the courtroom when the federal judge banged the gavel. He sobbed like a terrified child, begging for a leniency he had never once shown to anyone else. There was no mercy. He will be an old, broken, forgotten man by the time he ever sees the outside of a concrete cell. Vivian Vance. The woman who shared my bed, my home, and my life for 45 years received a 15-year federal sentence. The judge did not care about her country club memberships, her extensive charity luncheons, or her expensive designer shoes. She was formally convicted of accessory to attempted murder and severe federal document forgery. She traded her sparkling rhinestone evening gowns for a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit. She will spend the rest of her golden years sitting in a cold, barren room, entirely stripped of the high society status she was willing to kill me to maintain. I felt absolutely nothing reading her name in the paper. The woman I loved died long before she ever picked up that vial of poison. And then there is my daughter Maya. She avoided criminal prosecution because the federal investigators concluded she genuinely did not know about the haloperidol drops. But escaping prison did not mean she escaped the consequences of her profound betrayal. She could not avoid the catastrophic financial apocalypse her husband left behind. The bank immediately seized her sprawling suburban mansion. The aggressive creditors repossessed her luxury imported cars, froze all of her accounts, and liquidated every valuable asset she owned. She was left completely destitute, drowning under a mountain of secondary debts that Trent had secretly attached her name to during his desperate final months. I heard through Marcus that she is currently living in a tiny, cramped, run-down apartment on the far south side of the city. The wealthy socialites she desperately sought to impress abandoned her instantly. She is now working double shifts at a greasy fast food diner, scrubbing sticky floors and flipping burgers just to make minimum payments on her crushing debt. She had looked me in the eye and told me I was standing in the way of her grand future. She had chosen the illusion of wealth over the father who raised her. Now she is experiencing the real world in all its brutal, unforgiving glory. I do not send her money. I do not call her. The cord is completely and permanently cut. A young waitress walks out of the cafe, bringing me back to the present moment. She approaches my table with a warm, genuine smile and places a steaming ceramic mug of coffee gently in front of me. She asks if I need anything else. I thank her politely, and she walks back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the beautiful view of the construction site. I look down at the dark, steaming liquid inside the ceramic mug. I do not have to worry about what is hiding beneath the surface. I do not have to brace myself for the slow creeping fog of a chemical lobotomy. I reach out and pick up the mug. My hands are perfectly steady. The violent tremors that plagued me for weeks are completely gone from my system, washed away by time and medical detox. I bring the hot mug to my lips and take a slow, deep sip. It is pure, unadulterated black coffee. It is not sweetened with fake affection. It is not laced with betrayal or hidden agendas. It is extremely bitter, stinging the back of my throat. But that sharp bitterness is the exact taste of the unvarnished truth. And for the first time in a very long time, it is a truth that finally allows me to breathe. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the quiet green lawns of the Oakland Cemetery. I walked slowly along the winding stone paths, letting the rhythmic thump of my solid oak cane ground me in the peaceful silence. Far away from the noise of the city and the heavy machinery working on the new empowerment center, this was the only place I truly wanted to be today. I stopped in front of a modest, weathered granite headstone. It did not belong to a famous politician or a wealthy real estate mogul. It belonged to my father, A man who worked two backbreaking jobs his entire life with grease permanently stained into the calluses of his hands. I looked down at his name carved into the stone, and I felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my chest. My father was the one who bought the very first small parcel of land in downtown Atlanta over 50 years ago. It was just a rundown brick garage on a forgotten street corner, but to him, it was a kingdom. It was the absolute proof that a black man in the South could own a piece of the earth he stood on. When he passed away, he left that tiny garage to me. I took his sweat, his sacrifice, and his vision, and I spent decades buying up the surrounding lots one by one until it became the $30 million legacy block. I built an empire on the exact foundation he laid with his bare hands. I stood over his grave and I spoke to him in the quiet evening breeze. I told him that I kept it safe. I told him that his legacy was secure. But I also confessed how incredibly heavy the burden had been. I told him about the terrifying reality of discovering that the most dangerous predators were not the corporate sharks or the aggressive bankers trying to buy the land. The most dangerous predators were sitting at my own dining room table. They were eating the food I bought and sleeping in the bed I paid for. I told my father about the crushing heartbreak of watching the woman I loved for 45 years enthusiastically plot to destroy my brain. I told him how it felt to realize that my own daughter had been completely blinded by a cheap illusion of wealth, willing to trade her father's sanity for a luxury zip code. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the people you would take a bullet for are the ones secretly loading the gun. For a long time, I thought my job as a husband and a father was to provide, to protect, and to endure whatever flaws my family had. But sitting in that dark office, watching them casually count out drops of a chemical lobotomy into my coffee, I realized that endurance is not always a virtue. Sometimes endurance is just a slow, quiet suicide. I told my father that I did not let them tear down what we built. I did not let a desperate, arrogant fraud like Trent turn our generational triumph into a cheap bargaining chip for a Ponzi scheme. I wielded the axe. I cut down the rotting branches of my own family tree to save the roots. I am 70 years old now. Society tells you that at 70 your story is mostly written. They tell you that you are supposed to quietly fade into the background surrounded by your children and your grandchildren. I do not have a wife anymore. I do not have a daughter who speaks to me. I am walking into the final chapters of my life completely and utterly alone. But as I stood there in the quiet cemetery breathing in the cool autumn air, I realized that solitude does not equal emptiness. My solitude is my absolute freedom. I am no longer a pawn in someone else's greedy game. I am no longer an obstacle waiting to be removed. I am not a walking wallet or a target for manipulation. I am a man who stared down a lethal betrayal and walked out of the fire completely unburned. My legacy is no longer just concrete and steel. It is the community center rising from the ashes of my son-in-law's ruined empire. It is the future generations of young entrepreneurs who will build their dreams on the exact same soil my father fought so hard to claim. I reached out and rested my hand on the cool granite of my father's headstone for one long final moment. I promised him that I would keep living, keeping my eyes wide open and my mind razor sharp. I turned around and walked back down the stone path toward my car. The sun was finally setting over Atlanta, casting a brilliant, fiery glow across the horizon. My life was not ending. The heavy toxic curtain had simply been lifted and the real show was just beginning. Blood does not make a family, respect and loyalty do. We often close our eyes to the toxicity of our loved ones, believing that endurance is a form of love. But when greed poisons the roots, true love means wielding the axe. Never allow someone to treat you as a disposable stepping stone for their ambitions, regardless of the history you share. Dignity has no expiration date, and justice is not reserved for the young. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is letting those who dug a grave for you fall into it themselves. Walk away and rebuild. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about truth, survival, and ultimate justice. Thank you for watching and stay strong.